Hey there, and welcome back. Tonight, we're traveling into one of history's deepest mysteries. Why so many ancient civilizations, once mighty and thriving, suddenly vanished. Great cities rose, filled with temples, markets, art, and life. They commanded armies, controlled trade, and seemed eternal. Yet one by one, they fell silent. Streets emptied. Walls crumbled. What was once filled with the sounds of human ambition became nothing more than ruins, swallowed by earth and time. Imagine the Indus Valley, with its carefully planned streets and advanced plumbing, gone without a trace of explanation. Picture Teotihuacan, a massive city in Mexico with pyramids that still stand tall, yet whose people disappeared almost overnight. Think of the collapse of the Maya, the mystery of the sea peoples, and the whispers of Atlantis, each story reminding us that even the strongest societies are fragile. Sometimes the causes were natural, droughts, floods, or plagues that broke entire populations. Sometimes they were human, greed, division, war, and choices that stripped the land bare. And sometimes the truth remains hidden, leaving us only with questions and shadows. So settle in, get comfortable, and let's journey through the echoes of forgotten worlds, exploring why civilizations rise and why they so often vanish into silence. The ruins whisper in the hush of dawn, their broken stones half hidden by windswept sands and encroaching vines. Each fallen wall, each toppled column, holds a secret folded between the lines of history. Once here, people dreamed of eternity. They built cities of stone and clay, carved stories into tablet and stele, wove networks of trade that bound mountains to seas. Then, just as suddenly as they rose, they vanished, leaving behind empty plazas, silent pyramids, and the faint echo of voices carried off by time. Why did so many ancient civilizations collapse and disappear? That is the question we follow into the past, seeking understanding in the gaps of memory. From the dense canopy of the Maya lowlands to the irrigated fields of the Indus Valley, from the fertile crescent between the Tigris and Euphrates to the sun-bleached stones of Easter Island, human communities once flourished with ingenuity and ambition. They harnessed rivers for irrigation, mastered bronze and iron, formed dialects and faiths, charted the sky's passage. Their achievements still astound us: precise observatories, aqueducts that carried water for miles, marketplaces bustling with goods from distant lands. Yet somewhere in their success lay the seeds of decline, visible only in the discoloration of pottery shards and the change in pollen trapped in lake beds. The Maya, architects of stepped pyramids and astronomical calendars, prospered for centuries in what is now southern Mexico and Guatemala. Their city-states rose one after another, each new palace more elaborate than the last, each stela inscribed with the reign of a king destined for eternity. But by the 9th century, many of those great centers, Tikal, Palenque, Copan, fell silent. Walls crumbled without hands to repair them. The forests reclaimed the plazas. Scholars debate causes: protracted droughts, deforestation, soil exhaustion, internecine warfare. Perhaps it was the combination of a changing climate and overtaxed lands, a feedback loop of desperation that no ruler's decree could arrest. Farther west, the Indus Valley civilization thrived along the banks of the Ravi and Gaga rivers from roughly 2600 to 1900 BCE. In the twin cities of Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro, grid-patterned streets and sophisticated drainage systems testified to a mastery of urban planning unmatched for millennia. Yet around 1900 BCE, those streets emptied. No invading hordes left their mark. The script remains undeciphered, leaving us unable to read their final words. Recent studies hint at monsoon shifts, tectonic upheaval that altered river courses, and the draining away of water sources. As wells went dry and fields failed, the population drifted away, seeking sustenance in more forgiving lands. Between those two great civilizations lay Mesopotamia, cradle of writing and empire. Sumerian city-states such as Uruk and Ur flourished from 3500 BCE onward, trading with lands as far as the Indus Valley. Their ziggurats rose like stepped mountains, and their scribes recorded grain deliveries and legal codes on clay tablets. Yet by 2000 BCE, the canals that irrigated southern Mesopotamia began to clog with salt, a byproduct of floodwaters rising and evaporating in the sun. Croplands yielded less each year, and with dwindling food supply came social upheaval. New powers Babylonia, Assyria rose and fell, but the original Sumerian roots faded into the murky sediment of history. On the Isle of Crete, the Minoan civilization shone around 2000 BCE with palatial centers like Knossos, adorned with vibrant frescoes of dolphins and dancers. They traded olive oil and pottery across the Mediterranean, linking Crete to Egypt and the Levant. Then came the cataclysm of Thera-modern Santorini, when a massive volcanic eruption sent shockwaves through sea and sky. Tsunami waves overwhelmed coastal settlements, and ash blotting out the sun may have triggered crop failures. In the decades that followed, Minoan influence waned, palaces burned, and Crete's legacy merged into the wider tapestry of ancient Greece. In the rainforests of Southeast Asia, the Khmer Empire built Angkor Wat in the 12th century CE, channeling rivers into reservoirs and carving stone temples that aligned with equinoxes. Its hydraulic network sustained rice cultivation that fed hundreds of thousands. Yet by the 5th-10th century, the canals silted, the reservoirs cracked in prolonged droughts, and societal structure unraveled. Invasions from neighboring kingdoms compounded internal stresses. Though the temples remain, the city's lifeblood, a complex water management system, could not endure shifting climate patterns and political turmoil. Across the Colorado Plateau, the ancestral pueblones of Chaco Canyon constructed great houses of sandstone and timber, spanning rooms by the thousands and aligning structures with solar cycles. Between 900 and 1150 CE, this desert community harvested rainwater, traded turquoise, and thrived against all odds. Yet a sequence of megadroughts from 1130 to 1180 CE parched the canyon. Wells ran dry, corn stalks dwindled. People migrated south and west, abandoning their cliff dwellings to the silent wind. The ruins, still echoing with footsteps, stand testament to adaptation and the limits of survival in a changing world. Higher still, Norse settlers in Greenland landed around 985 CE, lured by reports of grazing pastures and abundant game. For centuries, they raised sheep and hunted seals, trading walrus ivory for European goods. But as the Little Ice Age set in around the 14th century, pack ice choked coastal waters, shortening growing seasons and isolating Greenland from resupply ships. Intermittent famine and depopulation followed. By the mid-1400s, the Norse settlements had vanished, leaving only lonely stone churches to mark their passing. On a remote spit of land in the southeastern Pacific, the people of Rapa Nui Easter Island carved monumental statues known as moai. To erect these colossal figures, they felled nearly every tree on the island, unaware that deforestation would starve the soil and leave hillsides exposed to erosion. As tree cover vanished, so did the birds that nested in their branches. Agriculture struggled on degraded land. Civil strife erupted as resource scarcity bred conflict. When European explorers arrived in the 18th century, they found a society fractured and nearly extinguished. These disparate tales share common threads: vulnerability to environmental shifts, resource overexploitation, social fragmentation, and sometimes external invasions or diseases. Intricate trade networks could not compensate when local food production collapsed. Elaborate religious and political systems crumbled under the weight of successive stresses. Yet in each case, people sought solutions: water management innovations, terraced agriculture, shifts in settlement patterns, only to discover that adaptation has its limits when change accelerates beyond capacity. Archaeologists sift through layers of ash, pollen, and pottery to reconstruct these narratives. Climate proxies and ice cores and tree rings reveal unexpected droughts and cold spells. Geoarchaeological surveys uncover canals and terraces now buried beneath silt. Bioarchaeologists analyze teeth and bones for signs of malnutrition and disease. Each fragment adds detail to a mosaic of collapse and renewal, of ingenuity countered by forces both human and natural. The haunting question remains: why did so many civilizations, each brilliant in its own era, vanish? Perhaps the answer is not single or simple. Rather, it lies in the interplay of variables: climate variability, ecological capacity, governance structures, social cohesion, and external pressures. In some moments, the balance tipped; in others, it held. The difference between survival and collapse could hinge on a single season of drought or a brief eruption of volcanic ash. As we gaze upon these ancient ruins, we confront our own fragility. Modern societies boast technological marvels and vast global networks, yet we remain subject to the same fundamental dependencies: food, water, climate stability, and social trust. The lessons of vanished civilizations urge us to build resilience, diversifying food sources, strengthening institutions, preserving ecosystems, and preparing for extremes. They remind us that complexity, if unchecked, can become vulnerability. In this pursuit of understanding, the ruins are more than silent stones. They are teachers. They invite us to listen to the wind rustling through broken columns, to the patterns in the earth that mark old riverbeds, to the faint echoes of footsteps on ancient plaster. They urge us to ask not only how these societies disappeared, but how we might avoid the same fate. Their stories, written in dust and stone, form a tapestry of warning and hope. Tonight, as the world outside settles into darkness, let your mind wander among these deserted plazas and sunken dwellings. Imagine the sunrise glinting off palatial walls, the laughter of children by canal banks, the procession of priests bearing offerings to temple altars. Then consider how swiftly those scenes faded, leaving only questions in their wake. In this mystery, we find both the allure of the past and the urgency of our present moment. Welcome to the mystery of vanished empires. As you drift into sleep, carry their lessons gently with you. That civilizations flourish on the thin edge of balance. That collapse can come without warning, and that resilience is born of humility before the forces that shape our world. When dawn returns, may we wake with fresh resolve to honor the legacy of those who built and vanished, and to safeguard the future of those who have yet to rise. The sun rises across a cracked plain, its light pale and hesitant, as though unsure it still belongs here. Below, the earth bears the memory of ages. Riverbeds that ran full only decades ago, now yawning craters of dust, scampering gullies carved by sudden floods, and channels where water once slipped in silver ribbons. Every grain of sand, every flake of silt, holds a story of survival and loss, stories written in the language of rainfall, of parched fields, of torrents that turn life to mud in an instant. Imagine a great city built beside a mighty river, its walls gleaming in the morning. Farmers tend fields of grain that stretch to the horizon, irrigated by canals whose ancient stones channel water with precision. Then, without warning, the rains fail. Monsoon clouds drift away to distant lands, and months pass without a single drop. Wells dry to cracked hollows. Reservoirs, once brimming, shrink to riddled shells. Neighbors grow tense as government decrees ration water to palace gardens first, leaving common fields abandoned. Grain prices double and triple. Children wander in search of fodder for starving livestock. As desperation mounts, families abandon ancestral homes in search of greener valleys, and the city's chorus of market calls fades to an echo. Elsewhere, a different city stands at a river's mouth, its prosperity built on controlling floods. Embankments rise like ramparts, holding back the spring swell. Each year, Canals carry life-giving floodwaters deep into rice paddies and palm groves. Then a season of storms arrives that no engineering can contain. Torrents breach the levees. Mud surges through streets, dragging homes off their foundations, turning marketplaces into quagmires of broken wood and drowned goods. Survivors cling to rooftops, awaiting rescue. Crops rot in fields under thick layers of silt. After the waters recede, fields lie buried beneath coarse sediment. Men and women labor for years to clear the muck, but some lands never recover. Abandoned temples sink into marshes, their spires the only landmarks in the watery waste. In the highlands, a mountainous realm depends on predictable spring snows to feed its rivers. Farmers plant terraces on steep slopes, trusting that meltwater will cascade just when seedlings need it most. For centuries, this cycle endures, and winters grow warmer. Snowfalls diminish, glaciers shrink. Streams that once flowed year-round dwindle in midsummer. Upland pastures turn to dust. Herdsmen drive goats and sheep ever higher in vain search of grass. Mountain villages fall silent as people drift to distant towns. The fragile web of social ties, shared labor on hillside fields, cooperative grain storage, is severed when the last ounce of community grain vanishes in a drought year. Climate's invisible hand shapes even the greatest empires. In a sunlit plain by a storied river, ancient scribes recorded the rise of kings and the building of ziggurats in clay tablets. Their irrigation canals once carried water for miles. But over centuries, salt from repeated flooding accumulated in the soil. Farmers applied ever more water to flush the salts away, only to see them reappear in greater concentration. Fields turned white with crystallized minerals, crops wilted, and peasants rebelled. Royal armies marched to enforce quotas, but rebellion spread. City-state after city-state fell silent, drowned not by invading foes, but by the slow suffocation of their fields. In the dense jungles of a distant land, great pyramids rose above the treetops. Rulers marked the passage of seasons by watching Venus rise over temple peaks. They diverted swamps into raised gardens that fed thousands. But when a multi-decadal drought arrived, the canals that drained the swamps ran dry. Reservoirs failed. Leaders drilled new wells in a desperate effort to sustain palace life. Meanwhile, smaller villages vanished first. Then, larger cities emptied. The few who remained turned to each other in conflict over scarce water, toppling dynasties older than most nations. Over centuries, the jungle reclaimed the stonework, hiding its secrets beneath vines and earth. Even the sea's rhythm can break a civilization. Along a fertile coast, fishermen and farmers trade with merchants from afar. Salt pans line lagoons, and coastal defenses guard cities from high tides. As sea levels inch upward over centuries, shoreline erosion accelerates. Port structures weaken, rice fields flood with salt water, and freshwater springs near the shore become brackish. Merchants sail shorter routes. Trade dwindles. Farmers dig new wells inland, only to find aquifers depleted. Coastal citadels hollow out as people flee toward upland refuges, abandoning stone docks and warehouses to the encroaching sea. At the core of these stories is a single truth. Every society rests upon the balance of water, climate, and land. When that balance shifts, even subtly, the first cracks appear in the foundations of power. Grain reserves meant to last a famine year vanish in months. Public works designed for one set of conditions crumble under another. Social contracts, implicit in every irrigation decree and flood control measure, fray when elites hoard what little remains. Technologies once heralded, as solutions become burdens when the environment changes faster than engineering can adapt. Reservoirs fill with silt, requiring laborious dredging that elites no longer fund. Canals erode their banks as flows become either too torrential or too scant. Wells mouth with arsenic when water tables drop. Dams collapse under heavy rains, unleashing death rather than safeguarding fields. Each failure deepens public mistrust, as temples once revered as guarantors of cosmic order can no longer deliver rains or protect from floods. Yet societies do not always collapse. In some regions, people anticipate variability and weave resilience into daily life. They diversify crops, planting millet beside maize, sweet potatoes beside yams, that mature at different times and tolerate diverse rainfall patterns. They rotate fields and let lands lie fallow, giving soils time to recover. They build levees that can be lowered in flood years and raised in dry ones. They store water in cisterns that cap reservoirs with impermeable clay linings. They codify water rights and laws that prevent overuse and ensure that every household gets a share in times of plenty and want. Even when change overwhelms these measures, human ingenuity sparks new lifelines. Engineers canalize distant rivers to feed thirsty cities. Traders bring grain by caravan from surplus regions. Communities shift settlements to more favorable microclimates, following the shifting fringes of rainfall. They invent drought-resistant crops, crossbreeding wild relatives to yield strains that thrive on half the water. They develop flood-tolerant rice varieties that survive submerged fields. Over generations, these adaptations carve new paths to survival. Climate stress can also reshape societies in positive ways. Competition for water can lead to federated institutions that pool resources, creating wider networks of cooperation. Long-distance trade networks expand as people learn to rely on imports when local fields fail. Religious and philosophical systems emerge that emphasize reciprocity with nature. Stewardship of land and reverence for water is sacred. Technological and institutional innovations meddle. Plowshare forging, equitable grain banking, communal dam governance often trace their origins to crises driven by droughts or floods. But these successes are never guaranteed. Shifting climates can outpace political will, catching rulers unprepared. Epidemics can follow famine, decimating labor forces just when rebuilding is most urgent. Trade routes can close in times of conflict, leaving isolated communities stranded without outside aid. Local innovations may not spread quickly enough to adapt entire nations. The difference between adaptation and collapse can hinge on timely action, social cohesion, and humility in the face of nature's power. By studying the scars of past societies, from the dry beds of vanished canals to the sediment-filled cores of ancient reservoirs, we learn crucial lessons for our own era. As modern climates warm, monsoons shift, glaciers melt, and extreme events intensify, our sophisticated technologies may prove surprisingly fragile. Our global supply chains, like ancient irrigation networks, can fail when a single link breaks. Our densely populated coastal megacities could face waves and saltwater intrusion far beyond historical precedent. Yet we also possess assets unseen by ancient rulers. Real-time satellite monitoring of drought signals, advanced climate models predicting floods months in advance, genetic tools to breed crops tolerant of heat and salinity, and international institutions dedicated to disaster relief. We can build on millennia of human adaptation, integrating traditional knowledge of seasonal rhythms with cutting-edge science to forge resilient landscapes and societies. In the end, the weight of the environment is a story written in water and wind, in the dance of sun and storm. It reminds us that our fates remain entwined with the natural world, that every irrigation canal, every flood levee, every seed planted in hope carries within it the potential for both life and loss. As we move forward, may we carry these echoes of droughts and deluges as guides rather than warnings, a living memory of how fragile and yet how adaptable human societies can be when we listen to the land and build our future upon its rhythms. The fields lay bare beneath a relentless sun, the once dark soil now pale and lifeless. Cracks spiderweb across parched earth where green shoots should rise. Here, the story of human ambition meets the unforgiving truth of ecology, the curse of the soil. Over millennia, societies have tilled, cleared, and irrigated their lands in ever greater pursuit of surplus. Yet in doing so, they triggered a chain of events: deforestation, erosion, salinization, nutrient depletion that turned their breadbaskets into dust bowls and silenced the hum of civilization. Imagine a river valley hemmed in by crumbling walls and ornate temples. Beneath those stones, generations of farmers coaxed harvests from rich alluvium carried each year by the floods. They built canals and dikes, cultivating wheat and barley on soils so fertile they seemed immortal. But with every new orchard and grove, trees fell to the axe, their roots no longer binding the earth. Without shade and leaf litter, rains ran off in torrents, carrying precious topsoil downstream. Silt clogged irrigation channels. Fields lay waterlogged or bone dry, depending on the season's whim. Texts from scribes lament the salinization that tainted wells and fields alike. By the time the last ziggurat crumbled, the land beneath it had become a bitter wasteland no grain could grow in. On a distant island, isolated by endless waves, a people once carved gigantic statues of stone, each figure taller than the tallest man. To heave Maui into place, they felled every palm and hardwood tree on their shores, fashioning rollers and ropes from the living forest. As the trunks vanished, so did the birds that nested in the canopy. Soil washed unguarded into the sea, stripping the island of its thin veneer of fertility. Gardens yielded only famine crops. Fishing boats, deprived of lumber, lay rotting on the beach. Conflict erupted over the last scraps of food and wood. When explorers arrived centuries later, they found a ghostly landscape of toppled statues and empty villages, testaments to an ecological gamble lost. In the jungles of Central America, a sophisticated civilization thrived. They built towering pyramids, aligned plazas with the heavens, and fed thousands from terraced fields carved into steep hillsides. They cleared forests to plant maize in vast swaths, relying on shifting field agriculture. Yet as intensification spread, soils weakened. Nutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium leached away under torrential rains. Farmers moved their fields to fresh patches, but the new clearings demanded fresh soil to be burned and manured. Pollen cores show a sharp decline in prolific crops, while charcoal layers spike, marking centuries of slash and burn. As yields fell, competition for fertile land sparked conflict, fracturing alliances and draining the tax base that once funded grand building programs. City-states fell silent as fields lay fallow, and the jungle reclaimed what it had once relinquished. Along the Mediterranean's sun-baked shores, an empire rose on olives and wine. Forests on the hillsides yielded lime for construction and wood for shipyards, feeding a growing city's expansion. Terraced vineyards marched down slopes once clothed in pines, and goatherds munched scrub to barren stumps. Soil started to erode, and once fertile strips turned to rocky dust. Archaeological surveys reveal gullies where roads once led to bustling ports. By the time the empire's marble columns stood empty, the very land they conquered lay stripped of life, its topsoil scattered to the winds of centuries. In the high plains of Mesopotamia, a complex irrigation network turned desert into farmland. Over 2 millennia, canals wound through clay walls, drawing water from the great rivers to feed cities and orchards. But without natural drainage, salts accumulated with each irrigation cycle. Wheat fields glowed pale with crystallized minerals. Farmers dug ever deeper canals to flush salts away, only to see them return in greater concentration. Clay tablets record a steady decline in yields, a creeping desperation that led to land sales and debt peonage. When the last canal bank collapsed, so too did the society that depended on it. In the foothills of the Andes, a society engineered mountainsides into step terraces. They channeled rainfall into cisterns, rotating crops to preserve fertility. Yet even these sophisticated measures strained under growing populations. Intensive cultivation of potatoes and maize depleted essential micronutrients. Geochemical studies of terra soils reveal falling levels of phosphorus and sulfur. As yields stagnated, communities fragmented, migrating to marginal lands in search of relief. In time, the grand terraces fell into disrepair, their stones reclaimed for new buildings in distant settlements. Across the Silk Road, ancient Iran bore witness to resource exhaustion on a grand scale. The Sassanid Empire harnessed Qanat systems' underground aqueducts to irrigate palm groves and date orchards. Each Qanat capped into a fragile water table, draining aquifers that recharged only in rare flood years. As fields expanded, groundwater levels fell. Irrigation wells ran dry, and rivers shrank to trickles behind silt-filled dams. Farmers left their villages, caravans ceased, and the desert dunes reclaimed the oasis cities, burying them beneath shifting sands. In every landscape, the curse of the soil followed a familiar pattern. Resource abundance led to overexploitation, which led to environmental degradation, which in turn undermined food production, social cohesion, and ultimately political stability. But this is not a story of inevitable downfall. Rather, it is a cautionary tale of balance. Where some societies succumbed, others adapted. In arid lands, farmers developed windbreaks of thorny shrubs to trap soil, while in tropical climates, they mixed tree intercropping with ground covers to sustain nutrients. Wherever soil loss threatened, communities innovated with green manures and compost, rotating legumes to fix nitrogen and maintain fertility. Even when soils failed, humans found ways to press on. Trade networks carried grain from fertile heartlands to starving provinces. Communal granaries smoothed surpluses into lean times. Crop diversification ensured that one failed species did not spell famine. Yet these strategies required foresight, cooperation, and the willingness to live within nature's bounds rather than press it to breaking. As we look back across centuries, the curse of the soil reveals both our greatest strengths and vulnerabilities. It shows us that soil, nearly invisible beneath our feet, is the foundation of every harvest, every economy, every empire. When we strip it away, we lose our capacity to feed ourselves, to build our cities, and to sustain our cultures. But when we honor it through conservation, regeneration, and respect for its limits, we unlock its power to nurture life. In our modern age of mechanized agriculture, synthetic fertilizers, and global trade, we risk repeating the mistakes of the past on a planetary scale. Soil erosion now strips billions of tons of earth each year. Chemical inputs degrade soil health. Deforestation and urban sprawl replace living lands with concrete. Yet the solution lies within reach. Regenerative practices that rebuild organic matter, agroforestry systems that mimic native ecosystems, policies that value soil's role in climate mitigation and food security. The curse of the soil is neither myth nor destiny. It is a reckoning with our relationship to the land. It reminds us that every seed sown carries responsibility, that each field tilled can heal or harm, and that the ground beneath our feet demands care as much as reverence. As we move on to the next chapter of our journey, examining the tension between human ambition and nature's capacity carry this lesson forward. Soil sustains us, and in its health lies the promise of renewal for civilizations yet to rise. The sun hides behind a shifting veil of dust and smoke, and in the fading light you feel it first in your chest, a tickle, a dryness that turns each swallow into ash. In ancient cities from Athens to Antioch, this was how plagues began. Unseen invaders carried on the breath of strangers, slipping through crowded gates and into the crowded lungs of women and men who had never known illness like this before. They called it pestilence, divine punishment, the curse of Atropos. But to those who lived through it, it was simply the silent killer that came with no warning and no mercy. In 430 BCE, as the Peloponnesian War raged, Athens shut its gates and packed its citizens inside stone walls meant to protect them. But the city became a trap. Thucydides describes fever and thirst, bodies ablaze, eyes bleeding, mind unraveling in delirium. The crammed houses and littered streets turned into a furnace. Priests and generals fell alike. Bodies piled in the agora until the stench summoned flies and vultures. At the height of the epidemic, thousands died each day. When Pericles himself succumbed, the people lost faith in their leaders and in their gods, and the war, already tenuous, slipped toward ruin. Decades later, around 165 CE, another calamity struck the Roman world. Soldiers returning from eastern campaigns carried back a disease that spread from the heart of the empire to its furthest provinces. The Antonine Plague, likely smallpox or measles, sprouted fever, rash, and agonizing coughs. Towns that had teemed with soldiers and traders fell silent as 1 in 4 citizens perished. Grain shipments slowed as workers disappeared. Tax revenues collapsed. Armies could not muster enough men. Marcus Aurelius wrote of death as cold grip, closing around Rome's streets, and even hymned the plague's lesson in his meditations, the fragility of life. In the 3rd century, as Rome teetered under military usurpations and economic crises, the plague of Cyprian arrived, its name given centuries later by the bishop who survived it. He chronicled legs swelling with ulcers, mouths frothing with foul breath, minds stricken by madness. As panic swept through marketplaces, commerce froze. Caravans turned back. Workshops shut their doors. Civic rituals ceased, and priests abandoned altars. With religious rites broken, fear grew and suspicion spread. Some whispered that the plague was poison in the water. Others blamed enemies across the Rhine and Euphrates. Yet no conspiracy explained the bodies crumpled in the streets. Half a millennium passed before plague's shadow returned in full force. In 541 CE, during Justinian's reign, a Black Death descended upon Constantinople. A pounding bear's croak in the throat, swelling buboes the size of apples under arms and groins. Ships anchored at the Golden Horn disgorged rats carrying infected fleas, and the city's water supply became infused with disease. Theodorus the Confessor recorded that the stench was fragrant by comparison. Markets were deserted, and even the imperial court fled. When the plague peaked, a quarter of the city's inhabitants died in weeks. Justinian's dream of restoring Roman glory faltered as manpower and wealth drained away. Beyond the great capitals, lesser-known scourges reshaped civilizations. In China's Han Dynasty, smallpox stalked along Silk Road trading routes. Merchants brought coin and silk one season, and the next they brought fevers that blackened tongues and left survivors scarred for life. Court physicians prescribed elixirs of mercury and jade dust, but those could not cure what no healer understood. As emperors established isolation camps, local officials gave up on lockdowns that starved entire provinces. Peasant revolts flared where famine followed plague, and the Han state fractured into warring kingdoms. Farther west, in the 7th century, the Arab world encountered serious pestilence, rumored to have killed tens of thousands in Damascus alone. As armies camped near the city, tents became mass graves. The Arab conquest continued, but the loss of soldiers slowed the advance. Caliphs dispatched caravans of food to quarantine towns, and walls were erected around the diseased quarters. In some regions, survivors worshipped in open air to avoid the plague's lair. Merchants adapted by shifting caravans to mountain passes, thought too cold for rats, inadvertently forging new trade corridors. And then came the medieval terror, the Black Death of 1347-1351, CI that swept from Central Asia across Eurasia to North Africa. In trading ports from Genoa to Alexandria, catapulted corpses and dying sailors alike infected everyone who touched them. The plague killed so swiftly that victims were often laid on carts by night and dumped into mass graves by dawn. Artisans vanished, leaving looms silent and forges cold. Peasants who remained grew emboldened, demanding higher wages. Feudal lords clung to power, but their armies lacked recruits. In some villages, survivors built walls of salt around the living to ward off the dead. Throughout history, plagues have had hidden mechanics. At the microscopic level, bacteria like Yersinia pestis and viruses like variola hitchhiked on fleas, rats, and human carriers. In crowded cities without sanitation, no barrier kept pathogens at bay. In times of war, refugee streams brought new germs to unsuspecting towns. Yet in each epidemic, society learned something about disease transmission from quarantine in Venice to cordon sanitaires in Cairo. Early forms of public health emerged: isolation hospitals, burial regulations, street cleaning ordinances. Even prayer gatherings moved outside city walls to avoid contagion. But those measures only delayed the inevitable. Without understanding germ theory, people relied on miasma theory polluted air and foul smells. They burned incense, sprinkled vinegar, and wore beak masks filled with aromatic herbs. Flagellant movements marched through towns, whipping themselves to cleanse sin and disease. When the plague passed, survivors often turned toward hedonism or fanatic mysticism, seeking to seize life or appease unseen gods. In both cases, the social fabric stretched under the weight of grief and guilt. Epidemics also rewrote the balance of power. The Justinian plague weakened Byzantium, just as the Lombards invaded Italy. The Antonine plague contributed to Rome's inability to repel Germanic incursions. The Black Death shattered the feudal system, eventually enabling stronger centralized monarchies in Europe. Plagues created labor shortages that granted serfs leverage to negotiate wages or flee to free cities. In the Muslim world, scholars noted falls in agricultural production and shifts in tax revenues, prompting land reforms. In China, the Yuan dynasty's collapse in part stemmed from plague-induced fiscal crises. Beyond mortality, plagues altered demographics and culture. Graveyards overflowed with the unburied. Art and literature turned to macabre themes. Danks macabre murals, Danks macabre poetry, and paintings of the triumph of death. The familiar world seemed to vanish in a fog of smoke and fever, and chronicles recorded unimaginable horrors: parents too weak to bury children, neighbors too afraid to offer water. In that void, new beliefs sprouted: the cult of saints associated with healing, the emergence of guilds dedicated to caring for the sick, and hospitals founded as refuges for plague victims. Yet in surviving, communities devised resilience. In Venice, the Lazaretto Vecchio Island became the world's first quarantine station. In Cairo, small wards called Maristans treated patients with baths, diets, and music therapy. In rural France, villages sealed roads to outsiders and rationed grain to prevent starvation. Guilds developed communal funds to support members struck by plague. Merchants financed caravans with caravanserais, offering isolation rooms. Even merchants' letters, sometimes the only records that survive, carry instructions to disinfect goods with fire or vinegar. The legacy of plagues endures in the landscape. Archaeogenetic studies have unearthed Yersinia pestis DNA in Bronze Age bones, suggesting even earlier pandemics shaped human history. In Europe, mass graves from 6th century Justinian plague sites lie beneath modern streets, their skeletons a silent testament. In East Africa, Islamic graves mark plague cemeteries near caravan routes. In Mongolia, crater-like sinkholes fill with water where nomads buried plague victims in shallow pits. These settings remind us that disease does not respect borders or class. But these unseen killers could never fully extinguish humanity. In time, survivors rebuilt walls, markets, and religious institutions. They bred disease resistance into their bloodlines, unwittingly shaping future generations. They established more robust medical systems, refined quarantine laws, and recorded vital statistics in parish registers. They redesigned cities with wider streets and more open squares, hoping to let air circulate freely. They adapted agricultural calendars to avoid harvesters crowded together. In essence, each plague forced human societies to confront mortality and to evolve. In the quiet that follows each epidemic, the world takes its first breaths. Bell towers toll the names of the dead. Mass-acre trenches become parks. Plowshares churn through disease-buried fields to sow fresh grain. Over decades, memory fades, and the stone walls of plague hospitals lose their inscriptions. In folklore, tales of the Grim Reaper merge with saints of healing. In architecture, cloisters and leprosaria speak of compassion born from horror. In science, the germ theory of disease lays roots centuries later, informed by centuries of trial and error. When we trace these lines from Athens to Alexandria, from Rome to Angkor, from Chang'an to Timbuktu, we see the unseen killers that toppled cities, invaded armies, and frayed empires. We see that no ruler, no priest, no healer possessed immunity. Only societies that recognized the invisible threat could hope to survive. And yet, each time, survival came at a price. Fewer mouths to feed, widened class divisions, new legal frameworks, and altered worldviews. Still, as we stand in the 21st century, armed with antibiotics, vaccines, and global surveillance, the lessons of ancient plagues echo. We remember that pathogens mutate, cross species barriers, and exploit human connectivity. We recall that poverty, urban overcrowding, and environmental degradation create breeding grounds for disease. We understand that trust in institutions and clear communication can save lives. And we know that in every pandemic's aftermath, there lies an opportunity to build back stronger, to weave public health into the fabric of society, and to remember the fragile balance between humanity and the unseen killers that traverse the air we share. A hush falls over the palace courtyard as the sky darkens without warning. Priests, draped in linen robes, fall to their knees before the altar of Amun-Ra, their chants rising in a tremor of dread. In moments like this, rulers learned that divine favor was no guarantee. It could slip away in a single omen, leaving kings and emperors vulnerable to the power of the gods. In ancient Egypt, Pharaoh Akhenaten broke the sacred contract. Declaring Aten, the sun disk, the only god, he tore down temples to Amun and banished the priesthood. At first, the court gleamed with the promise of a new dawn. But soon the Nile's annual floods weakened. Crops rotted in the fields, and the people whispered that Amun's wrath had been unleashed. When Akhenaten died, his name was erased from monuments. Priests of the old ways reclaimed their rituals, restoring balance, but forever undermining the pharaoh's divine authority. Far to the east, Chinese emperors ruled by the mandate of heaven. Heaven's favor was seen in plentiful rains and bountiful harvests, its withdrawal in drought and famine. In 1046 BCE, a predicted solar eclipse signaled the Shang dynasty's moral decay. King Wu of Zhou seized that omen, toppling the Shang with a coalition of disaffected princes. For centuries thereafter, every flood, every drought, every comet was read as a test of an emperor's virtue. When rivers swelled in the 9th century BCE, peasants rallied under local warlords, convinced that heaven no longer endorsed the Zhou court. What began as celestial warning became civil war. In the city-states of Greece, omens were woven into daily life. Augurs watched bird formations. Soothsayers read entrails. In 406 BCE, as Athens and Sparta warred, a meteorite crashed near Olympia. Oracles proclaimed it a harbinger of upheaval. Soon after, a devastating plague struck the crowded city, silencing the Agora's markets. Citizens lost faith in Pericles' leadership, and divergent factions blamed rival gods for the sickness. As belief fractured, alliances shifted, weakening Athens and sealing its fate in a war that had seemed winnable before the skies darkened. Rome, too, heeded signs in thunder and bird calls. When a lunar eclipse appeared in 390 BCE, The consul Marcus Furius Camillus faced defeat by the Gauls at the Allia River. Romans saw the eclipse as Jupiter's disapproval, and panic gripped the city. They abandoned sacred trusts treaties made under auspicious skies and rebuilt their defenses with newfound rigor. The Senate decreed public days of mourning, hoping ritual could appease the offended gods. From then on, Roman generals delayed campaigns until the heavenly omens were favorable. On the windswept steppes, the Xiongnu Confederacy read the heavens to guide migrations. In 50 CE, a spectacular comet blazed above the nomadic tents. Shanyu Hahanya interpreted it as heaven's command to seek peace with Han China. He journeyed to Chang'an and presented gifts to the Chinese emperor, shifting the balance of power. What began as a celestial portent became a diplomatic realignment that reshaped Central Asia. In the New World, Maya kings built pyramids aligned with Venus. When a 5-year drought parched the Yucatan, glyphs describe how priests fasted and offered human sacrifice to coax rain from Chak, the rain god. They dredged sacred cenotes and performed night-long ceremonies beneath the stars. Yet when the rains failed to return, faith in the divine order crumbled. City-state after city-state was abandoned, as priests lost the power to deliver the heavenly favor on which their authority depended. Farther south, the Inca Empire revered Inti, the sun god. When Viracocha's temples darkened under unseasonal storms, priests claimed Inti was angered by moral failings. Forced to perform daily rituals at dawn atop sunlit peaks, nobles discovered that omens could imprison them in endless ceremonies. When omens grew too frequent, eclipse after eclipse belief began to waver, eroding the divinity of Sapa Inca himself and fueling regional rebellions before the Spanish arrived. In medieval Europe, Holy Roman emperors wore crowns bestowed by the Pope, mediating between heaven and earth. Yet in 800 CE, a violent storm struck Rome just as Charlemagne knelt for coronation. Lightning split a temple roof, and Romans wondered if God truly sanctioned his rule. Though Charlemagne quelled dissent with force, doubt lingered at the edge of every cathedral's shadow, reminding both clergy and laity that religious legitimacy could fracture as easily as lightning cleaves stone. Even in the Islamic world, rulers claimed divine support. Caliphs read the phases of the moon and the appearance of comets as messages from Allah. During the Fourth Crusade in 1203, when Venetian ships were battered by sudden storms, Muslim chroniclers recorded that the Crusaders' cross lances glowed eerily in the sky. Frankish knights took this as a sign that their holy mission had lost favor. Their hesitation turned a pilgrimage into a sack of Constantinople, a deed that shook Christendom and fractured the crusading ideal. In Japan, emperors maintained harmony with kami through Shinto rites. In 664 CE, a mysterious epidemic swept through the Yamato court. Buddhist priests claimed the kami had grown angry, their ancient shrines neglected. Shinto priests responded by reviving purification rituals, dancing by rivers, rebuilding sacred groves, and presenting new offerings. Only when the epidemic eased did the court resume its ceremonies, but the scare planted seeds of uncertainty in the royal lineage's divine claim. On distant Easter Island, Rapa Nui chiefs carved moai to honor their ancestors, believing the statues carried mana spiritual power. When deforestation triggered soil erosion and crop failures, the people worshipped new gods in desperation. They toppled rival clan statues in rituals of desecration, convinced that cutting mana from their leaders would appease the land gods. The soil never recovered, and the once mighty kingdom dwindled behind ringed volcanic slopes. 1,000 years later in Europe, the Medici court in Florence courted astrologers to divine political fortunes. Lorenzo de' Medici used favorable star charts in public festivals to bolster his image. Yet in 1478, an ill-omened comet predicted an assassination attempt at the Pazzi conspiracy. When Lorenzo narrowly escaped, he capitalized on the omen staging parades under bright constellations to declare his cosmic vindication. His manipulation of belief entrenched Medici power, but also showed how omens could be wielded, both to topple and to buttress authority. Time and again, religion has been a double-edged sword for those in power. Divine sanction can elevate a ruler to near mythic stature, but when omens darken or faith falters, the same divine force can delegitimize regimes overnight. In every palace and temple, the gods lay claim to the fate of empires, whispering in thunder, dancing in comets, and warning through drought and disease. And when the people lose faith, even the grandest throne can crumble into dust. A low murmur drifts across the marble floors of the council hall as senators gather in the morning light. Their togas, once symbols of republican virtue, now hang heavy with the weight of ambition. In stained niches along the walls stand statues of Rome's founders Remus and Romulus. Romulus triumphant under Mars's approving gay silent witnesses to a union that once bound patrician and plebeian in a shared destiny. Yet as wealth flowed into the city through conquest and tribute, that shared destiny began to fray. In the wealthy villas atop the Palatine Hill, marble floors and frescoed walls told of luxury untold, while just beyond the Forum, beggars pressed ragged hands through iron grills, pleading for bread. Corruption whispered through the streets in the form of grafted contracts, rigged elections, and secret ballots sold to the highest bidder. The unity Rome needed to sustain its republic crumbled under the strain of greed. In Athens, too, pride in democracy faltered as moneyed interests manipulated courts and assemblies. On the Pnyx, where citizens once debated the fate of their city in open assembly, orators with silver tongues sowed division. They spoke in lofty rhetoric of freedom and justice, even as they accepted hidden gifts from wealthy patrons. When Pericles fell to the plague, his funeral speech echoed promises of equality, but his successors twisted those promises into tools for personal gain. Laws grew lax, and wealthy landowners evaded tax quotas, forcing ordinary farmers to shoulder an ever greater burden. As debt mounted and land passed into fewer hands, smallholders lost farms and their sons lost citizenship. The fields that fed Athens echoed with the silence of abandoned plows, and the chorus of civic pride gave way to a murmur of resentment. Not far to the east, the Han dynasty in China faced a similar unraveling. At the imperial court in Chang'an, eunuchs vied for favor, trading favors for gold. They whispered into the emperor's ear, convicting ministers of treason and elevating sycophants to high office. Meanwhile, wealthy landowners amassed vast estates by exploiting peasant labor, charging exorbitant rent and imprisoning those who fell behind. Tenant cultivators, once secure in their holdings, sank into perpetual bondage. Famine swept through the countryside during a series of drought years, and the land once the source of imperial stability became the stage for rebellion. In 184 CE, the Yellow Turban uprisings broke out, their banners proclaiming the coming of a new age free from the old order's corruption. Though the rebellions were crushed, the dynasty's foundations had been shattered by the very elites it had empowered. In the dense jungles of the Yucatan, Maya city-states glittered with jade and painted stucco. Kings descended from gods, and nobles feasted on maize and cacao imported through an intricate trade network. But as harvests grew lean, too much land lay fallow, and forest was sacrificed to shiny monuments. And nobles resisted land redistribution. They demanded tribute in the form of maize, cloth, and labor for their ambitious building projects. Commoners grew restless beneath the weight of corvée and high taxes. When drought returned century after century of parched skies, farmers found their fields dry and their granaries empty. Without the strength to resist, they deserted cities in search of more forgiving fields. The unity that once bound lords and peasants in reciprocal obligation perished under the heat of greed. On a remote Pacific island, Rapa Nui's chiefs oversaw the carving and erection of massive stone statues, the moai, believing they protected their people. To move these colossi across the island, they felled every palm and hardwood tree. banking on the promise of divine manna to secure future abundance. At first, the chiefs' power seemed unassailable. They controlled forests, fish ponds, and the limited fertile soils. But as the forests vanished, erosion stripped topsoil from slopes, and gardens ceased to yield. Fishing boats, once the horizon's silhouette, decayed on the shore without replacement wood. Clan rivalries deepened as elite families hoarded the remaining resources. Civil conflict erupted, Moai toppled in ritual defiance, and the unity of the island society fractured into warring enclaves. When European explorers arrived, they discovered skeletal villages ringed by barren hills, a monument not to devotion, but to the unchecked greed that uprooted both trees and trust. In the fertile plains of the Indus Valley, Harappan cities thrived behind protective walls of baked brick. Elites controlled granaries, water reservoirs, and trade routes reaching as far as Mesopotamia. They minted standardized weights, stamped seals with their insignia, and governed through councils whose decrees guided irrigation schedules. Yet as the climate shifted and monsoon patterns faltered, the lifeblood of these citadels' water became scarce. Elites diverted canals to favor their own crops, ignoring the pleas of lower-caste farmers. Wells ran dry, and parched fields cracked under the midday sun. As hunger gnawed, trust in the city councils vanished. Villages drifted away, leaving the grand citadel streets echoing with silence. Civilization retreated into smaller, kin-based groups, the memory of unity lost to dust. On the banks of the Tonle Sap, over 1,000 years ago, the Khmer Empire presided over elaborate waterworks that channeled monsoon flows into rice paddies. At Angkor, barays and canals stretched for mile symbols of divine king power. The elites claimed this bounty as proof of their heavenly mandate. Yet as the climate vacillated between flood and drought, maintenance of the hydraulic network faltered. Noble families competed over canal contracts, rewarding loyalists and punishing rivals. As villagers found their land under water one year and bone dry the next, resentment simmered. Peasant uprisings erupted along secondary channels. The unity that had fed great armies of temple builders crumbled under the strain of corruption and mismanagement. Angkor's reservoirs silted, temples sank beneath encroaching forest, and power shifted to neighboring centers less entranced by their own splendor. In the high Andes, the Inca Emperor Huayna Capac presided over a realm united by grand roads and storehouses in every province. But upon his unexpected death in 1525, two sons vied for succession. Elites in Cusco and Quito threw their support behind different heirs. Each promised tribute exemption and land grants to his faction, fueling greed among the nobility. Instead of settling the empire, these promises ignited civil war. As brother fought brother, Spanish conquistadors arrived with steel, horses, and disease. They exploited the fractured leadership, forging alliances with disaffected nobles. In the end, the unity that had held mountains and valleys together disintegrated, not under the might of an external foe, but under the weight of division stoked by selfish promise-making. In medieval Europe, the feudal system hinged on alliances between lords and vassals. But as towns grew richer through commerce, merchants clashed with noble privileges. Kings, seeking new revenues, imposed taxes on urban trade, angering burghers and breaking old accords. When the French crown demanded grain shipments for war, cities rebelled and formed communes, seizing tax revenues for their own defense. Merchants funded private armies, negotiating charters that enshrined their privileges. The unity of Christendom, once bound by shared faith and feudal loyalty, fractured into rivalries between rising bourgeois and declining aristocracies. Civil wars and peasant revolts followed, leaving Europe segmented and vulnerable to invasions. In the medieval Islamic world, the Abbasid caliphs in Baghdad once symbolized Muslim unity from Iberia to the Indus. Their libraries overflowed with knowledge. Their armies defended pilgrims and trade caravans alike. Yet as the capital's bureaucracy grew bloated, Viziers sold offices to the highest bidder. Corrupt judges issued verdicts for bribes, while tax farmers pocketed excess revenue. Provinces grew resentful under heavy levies and intrusive governors. Isolated governors declared independence, founding dynasties such as the Tulunids in Egypt and the Samanids in Persia. The unity of the empire dissolved into sultanates and emirates, no longer united by the caliph's name, but bound by regional interests. In Japan's Heian period, imperial court culture blossomed in Kyoto. Emperors, cloistered behind screens, conducted poetry contests, and sponsored elaborate ceremonies. Meanwhile, rival clans Fujiwara, Taira, Minamoto intermarried with imperial princesses, seizing regency posts and enriching themselves with land grants. As these aristocratic families grew more powerful, they withdrew lands from taxation, denying provincial governors revenue. Samurai bands rose to enforce local authority, selling protection to peasants for pay. The unity of the imperial court gave way to the rule of shoguns and the era of warring provinces. The peace once maintained by consensus eroded under the centrifugal pull of clan loyalty. On the plains of Mesopotamia, after Alexander's conquests, successor kingdoms vied for control. Ptolemies in Egypt and Seleucids in Syria diverted tribute rivers into their own granaries, leaving border cities impoverished. Local satraps enriched themselves by under-collecting taxes and pocketing the surplus. When small cities rebelled Persian revolts under Mithridates among them, empires responded with brutal suppression, further fueling resentment. Unity shattered under the lure of power and the promise of wealth. Border regions slipped from imperial grasp, and the vestiges of former glory became memories and local myths. In the Renaissance Italian city-states, Medici bankers in Florence and Sforza dukes in Milan cultivated alliances among wealthy merchants. Their patronage funded cathedrals and palaces, yet their ambition stoked rivalries. When Francesco Sforza suppressed a Medici-backed revolt in Bologna, Florence retaliated by forming new alliances, drawing Venice and Naples into a web of intrigues. Papal armies marched through Lombardy, soldiers pillaged fields, and peasants starved when taxes rose to fund the conflict. City-state unity dissolved with every new treaty, every broken pledge, every bribe paid to condottieri. The nation-state that would become Italy lay fractured in the divisions of greed. Across these landscapes, from Rome's Forum to Ankar's Beret, from Kyoto's court to Baghdad's libraries, the pattern repeats. Elites accumulate wealth and privileges. They bribe officials, monopolize resources, and leverage patronage networks to shield themselves from accountability. Ordinary people pick up the burden, paying higher taxes, surrendering land, and losing the voice that once bound them to rulers in exchange for protection and prosperity. As inequality widens, trust unravels. Leaders pursue narrow interests rather than the common good, fracturing unity into competing factions. Civil peace succumbs to civil war, and the complex systems that once held states together collapse under the weight of division. Yet in the ashes of these fallen societies lie lessons for our own. We see that corruption and inequality are not merely moral failures, but structural vulnerabilities. They erode the mutual obligations between rulers and ruled, dissolving the social contract that sustains collective action. When authority becomes a commodity, unity becomes an illusion. But history also shows paths to renewal, transparent institutions that check power, equitable resource distribution that binds people together, leadership grounded in service rather than privilege. In the silence of abandoned palaces and the dust of empty roads, we find not only cautionary tales, but guides to build a more resilient unity, one that weathers ambition without succumbing to the curse of greed and division. A column of dust rises on the horizon, tinted red by the setting sun. Riders appear through the haze, spears balanced on shoulders, cloaks snapping in the wind. The thundering of hooves grows louder, echoing against the city's stone walls. From behind battlements, archers knock arrows and defenders braced our gates. In these moments, the line between civilization and chaos hinges on a single decision, whether to open the gates in hopes of parley or to hold them fast against those who ride in flames and fury. On the vast Eurasian steppes, the Huns mastered this unforgiving landscape. Clad in leather and mounted on hardy horses, they struck like arrows loosed from the sky. Under the name of Attila, they swept across the Danube in the mid-5th century, overrunning villages before magistrates could call a council. Aquileia fell in flames. Milan's inhabitants melted away in terror. The walls of cities trembled when Attila's riders crested the hills. No fortress seemed impregnable, no tree unbreakable. In the space of a season, the Hunnic tide reshaped the fate of whole provinces. In 410 CE, a new wave surged against Rome's gates. Alaric and his Visigoths had long served as foederati-famed warriors under Roman command. Yet when pensions failed and promises broke, they pressed their claim in blood. On August 24th, the Visigoth king marched through the Salarian Gate, sacking Rome's palaces and temples. Silken banners were ripped from columns, golden idols trampled in dust. Citizens sheltered in Christian basilicas, their prayers unanswered beneath the clang of looted bronze. The Eternal City, once the world's heart, lay open to plunder and exile. 4 decades later, the Vandals crossed from Spain into North Africa. Gaiseric, their iron-willed king, seized Carthage and turned its harbors into a pirate kingdom. In 455, he sailed back to Italy under pretense of diplomacy. Instead, he led his fleet against Rome's fleet, burning 30 ships and blockading the Tiber. Then came the 14 days of unchecked pillage. Holy relics shipped off to Hippo Regius. Senators stripped of gold and silk. From that moment, vandalism became synonymous with wanton destruction. Half a world away, the rising tide of Islam swept through Syria and Egypt. In 641, Amr ibn al-Aha has laid siege to Alexandria, city of libraries and learning. Roman walls designed to repel barbarians could not hold against determined horsemen and shifting desert winds. As grain stores fell silent, Byzantine defenders retreated behind crumbling ramparts. When the city opened its gates, markets changed hands, churches became mosques, and the Mediterranean learned a new name for conquest. Under the banner of the Black Standard, Arab armies moved eastward into Persia. In 651 CE, at the ruins of Ctesiphon, the Sassanid throne fell to the invaders. Fire and steel erased palaces carved with ancient reliefs of heroes and deities. The imperial court fractured, retreating into the mountains. By the time the dust settled, centuries of Zoroastrian rites lay buried beneath desert sands, replaced by the call to prayer, echoing across ravaged ziggurats. 700 years later, a darker storm gathered on the steppes of Mongolia. Genghis Khan, born Temujin, united the fractious tribes under a code of iron discipline. His horsemen, armed with composite bows and steel sabers, rode with lethal speed. In 1221, the Khwarezmian cities lay in ashes. Bukhara's streets became rivers of smoke. Samarkand's scholars drowned in terror. Khan's engineers dug tunnels under city walls, then collapsed them with bags of earth and fire. The great centers of Islamic learning fell in weeks, their libraries and mosques destroyed in a single winter. In 1258, the Mongol horde reached Baghdad, once the beating heart of the Abbasid Caliphate. Hulagu Khan, Cengiz's grandson, encircled the city behind earthen mounds and wooden palisades. Siege engines hurled incendiary bombs across the Tigris. When the walls crumbled, survivors ran to the mosques for sanctuary. Instead, Mongol riders swept through the Friday prayer halls, steel flashing in the gloom. The House of Wisdom, repository of ancient texts, burned for days, turning the river black with ink and ash. 2 centuries passed before another firebrand rose from the steppes. Timur, known in the West as Tamerlane, claimed descent from Genghis Khan. His campaigns in Central Asia and India were marked by ruthless efficiency. In 1398, his army stormed Delhi's gates. Taj walls designed to repel elephants buckled under bombardment of flaming arrows. Chroniclers speak of pyramids of skulls on every sally port. When Timur rode south into Syria, he razed Aleppo and Damascus, leaving stone minarets shattered and caravans turned to dust beneath the desert sun. In 1453, the dawn broke red over the walls of Constantinople. Ottoman cannons under Mehmed II had pounded the ancient ramparts into rubble. Janissaries poured through breaches, torch in hand, slashing at defenders on the marble courts. For nearly 1,000 years, the city had stood between east and west. Now its golden domes glowed with flame. Christian churches became mosques. Statues of emperors lay crucified beneath crescent banners. The fall of Constantinople marked an end and a beginning, a new empire rising on the ashes of Byzantium. Across the ocean, invaders bore steel swords that spoke a different language of conquest. In 1521, Hernan courts reached the shores of Tenochtitlan, city of 100,000. Aztec canoes and causeways formed the world's most intricate floating metropolis. Courts bribed rival tribes, then pressed his attack. Under black banners and crossbow bolts, Spanish soldiers stormed the palace plazas. Montezuma's gold melted into European coffers. When smallpox swept through the city, the invaders marched in without resistance, raising temples to their own god. Tenochtitlan's canals ran red with blood and plague. Far to the south, Francisco Pizarro and his band of fewer than 200 Spaniards marched against Atahualpa's Inca Empire. At Cajamarca in 1532, priests repeated mass while muskets cracked through mountain air. Inca nobles fell in the dust, their empire collapsing with the death of a single ruler. Pizarro's men marched into Cusco, transforming the city's grand palaces into stone chapels and silver mines. The once glorious empire of the Andes vanished beneath the wheels of Spanish cavalry. Not all invaders came on horseback or in sailing ships. The Vikings, masters of longships, plundered coasts from Lindisfarne to Kiev. In 793, their axes split monastery doors, their swords silenced bells ringing matins. Wealth from Anglo-Saxon gold flowed back to the fjords, fueling the rise of new kingdoms at home. In 845, Viking raiders besieged Paris by the Seine, forcing Frankish princes to pay tribute of silver and land. Their lightning-quick raids turned rivers into invasion routes, and no coastal abbey felt safe against their thunder. Yet the Mongols' shadow returned to Europe in 1241, when Batu Khan's golden horde rode into Hungary and Poland. At Legnica and Mohi, European knights charged spear first into a sea of arrows. The field ran slick with blood as Mongol horse archers flanked both wings. In weeks, entire provinces lay depopulated, refugee streams choking mountain passes. When Baitu halted his advance, the cities stood in ruins, the royal chancelleries silent, and embers still smoldered in once bustling marketplaces. Invaders at the gate brought more than weapons. They carried new languages, faiths, and technologies, iron-working skills, siegecraft, horse breeding that reshaped distant lands. Sometimes they settled among the conquered, grafting steppe customs onto local traditions. The Goths preserved a version of Roman law in Spain. The Moors left irrigation canals in Andalusia. The Mongols adapted to Persian administration. Yet in the moment of conquest, unity dissolved in the flames. Under siege, unity faltered. Leaders who once marshaled civic pride found their voices drowned by the clash of steel and the wail of archers. Citizens who had looked to the sky for omens now knelt at battlements for deliverance. When lions of empire fell, their bones bleached beneath the sun, new jural orders rose on foreign tongues, languages of commerce, conquest, and culture. Invaders at the gate remind us that no city, however grand, is immune to the iron will of a determined foe. Walls of granite and words carved in stone can be shattered by steel and fire. Yet even as rulers topple, people endure adapting to new masters, weaving fresh alliances, reconstructing shattered streets from the same dust. In the hollow left by invaders, the seeds of tomorrow's civilizations take root, nourished by the memory of flames and the promise of renewal. A desert wind stirs the dust along an empty caravan road, where once a column of camels hearkened merchants laden with silks, spices, and salt. In distant ports, ships rocked at anchor beneath masts that pointed toward the ends of the known world. Markets overflowed with foreign coin, and city walls bore inscriptions honoring trade gods. Yet this was no moment of triumph, but the eve of undoing, when the arteries of commerce grew brittle, trade routes fractured, and entire economies turned to dust. Imagine the grand avenues of Harappa, where standardized weights measured grain imported from fields 10 days' march away. Seals stamped with traders' marks sealed jars of lapis lazuli carried from distant hills. Then the monsoon shifted. The mighty river that fed the canals abandoned its ancient channel, turning canals into cracked gutters. As water slipped away, granaries emptied. Merchant guilds lost their bargaining power, and goods piled unsold in deserted warehouses. Without flow of maize, cotton, and traded lapis, Harappa's streets grew silent. The collapse of one river route unraveled a network that had bound dozens of settlements into a prosperous civilization. Centuries later, the Mediterranean world depended on the circuit of commerce linking Mycenae, Ugarit, and the Nile Delta. Bronze swords from Anatolia lay beside Egyptian scarabs and Canaanite wine jars in the Aegean tombs. Caravans linked the spice-scented Levant with the Americ Baltic. But around 1200 BCE, that network splintered. Droughts shrank harvests. Famines forced peoples to uproot. Marauding sea peoples raided coasts unchecked. Coastal cities that had thrived on cargo-laden ships found their harbors abandoned. Merchant families fled inland, and the ancient script carved on palace tablets vanished. With the roots broken, the golden thread of trade that once wove civilization together turned to frayed ends. On the Silk Road, oases flourished where caravans paused to water horses and trade jade for wool. Saudian traders built inns that echoed with the clang of coins exchanged for Chinese silk and Indian spices. Then new horse nomads pressed westward, taxing or raiding passing caravans. Caravans turned south toward sea routes, leaving desert cities under siege by sand and specters of abandonment. Markets that once brimmed with gold coins and frankincense now lay roofless stones tumbled, effigies weathered by wind, and roots forgotten beneath drifting dunes. Rome's empire rested on the lifeblood of trade olive oil poured from amphorae, grain shipped from Egypt's granaries. Silks floated down the Silk Road. Roads built for legions became merchants' highways. But when the imperial bonds snapped under barbarian incursions, traders retreated behind collapsing frontiers. Ports that had sent ships to Britannia ceased paying port dues. Inland towns lost their markets as long-distance trade turned perilous. The city bakeries ran short of grain. Soldiers bivouacked on empty roads. Without the steady pulse of commerce, the empire's veins clogged and financial coffers bled dry. In West Africa, Ghana's wealth came from gold crossing the Sahara for salt, carried in caravans of carved gourds and leather sacks. Timbuktu's libraries teemed with manuscripts paid for in camel loads of leather and copper. When desert sands encroached on pasture and war disrupted trade, merchants rerouted south and east. Gold mines closed, markets contracted, and the great mud-brick mosques fell to ruin as salt caravans turned back. With trade gone, the region fractured into small kingdoms, each struggling to feed its people from the barren sands. Along China's Grand Canal, rice and timber flowed to feed the capital. Canal barges tied to towpaths creaked under the weight of taxes in kind. When the Mongol Yuan dynasty lost control, brigands lurked on inland waterways. Canal locks collapsed for lack of maintenance. Silt choked the channels. Grain boats from the south found themselves stranded on parched riverbeds. Without this arterial route, northern cities starved. Officials moved capitals. Courtiers fled. The Chinese heartland's prosperity drained away like water from a broken cistern. In medieval Europe, the Hanseatic League wove a web of trading cities from Lubeck to Novgorod, each ship's arrival promising timber, amber, herring, and fur. But conflicts across the Baltic and North Seas drove up insurance rates. New sea routes hugged coasts to avoid pirates, bypassing inland ports that once thrived. Merchants abandoned guild halls as trade tax revenues collapsed. Towns shrank. Warehouses rusted. City ring walls fell to ivy. Without the Hanseatic arteries, Northern Europe retreated into local markets and subsistence farming. Trades collapsed speaks in empty billows of cloth, abandoned counting tables, and silent harbor watchtowers. When routes dried up, so too did the jobs of mariners, porters, and scribes. Currency lost its promise coins melted down. Weights melted in fire pits to reclaim metals. Regional specialists, glassmakers in Syria, silk weavers in China, muleteers across Anatolia, found their crafts redundant. Starvation stalked the streets where wealth once danced in daily auctions. Yet no collapse occurred overnight. Town councils petitioned rulers for safe conduct for merchants. Guilds negotiated tariffs with new desert chieftains. States built new roads around raided passages. They minted new coinage and imported food from distant havens. But each solution drained resources from other needs: military, agriculture, civil services. The effort to reroute trade became a drain on the very prosperity it sought to preserve. The fall of trade is a tale of interdependence and fragility. One levee breaks, and the flood of commerce turns to stagnant pools. Oasis towns vanish, market towns shrink, and empires lose their pulse. As you drift into the memory of empty docks and abandoned caravanserais, remember that prosperity rides on the roads we build, and that when those roads break, so too can the fortunes of nations. They came from the sea. That is how the ancient inscriptions describe them, without origin, without warning. A confederation of peoples, unnamed and unknowable, who surged across the Mediterranean in the twilight of the Bronze Age. They arrived in ships, bearing weapons and fire, and left behind a trail of shattered cities, collapsed empires, and silence. The Sea Peoples, as modern historians call them, remain one of the great enigmas of antiquity. Their whispers echo through ruined palaces and scorched archives, hinting at a force that reshaped the ancient world. Around 1200 BCE, the Eastern Mediterranean was a tapestry of powerful civilizations. Egypt's new kingdom stood tall under Ramesses II, its temples gleaming with gold and its armies seasoned by conquest. The Hittite Empire ruled Anatolia from the fortified capital of Hattusa, commanding trade routes and vassal states. Mycenaean Greece flourished with palatial centers at Pylos, Tiryns, and Mycene, their walls etched with linear B tablets recording grain, oil, and tribute. In the Levant, cities like Ugarit and Byblos thrived as hubs of diplomacy and commerce, connecting the Aegean to Mesopotamia. Then, within a few decades, it all unraveled. The collapse was swift and widespread. Cities burned. Palaces were abandoned. Writing systems disappeared. Trade networks dissolved. Archaeologists call it the Late Bronze Age collapse, a period of upheaval so profound that it took centuries for the region to recover. And at the center of this storm were the Sea Peoples. Egyptian records, particularly those from the mortuary temple of Ramesses III at Medinet Habu, offer the most vivid accounts. Reliefs show chaotic naval battles, warriors with feathered helmets and round shields, and scenes of mass deportation. The inscriptions speak of northern peoples who came from the sea, attacking Egypt's borders in waves. Ramesses III claims victory, but the tone is defensive. His empire had survived, but only barely. Who were these invaders? The names recorded Shurden, Shekelesh, Luka, Peliset, Denyen, Weshesh offer tantalizing clues. Some may have originated in the Aegean, others in Anatolia, Cyprus, or even the western Mediterranean. The Shurden are often linked to Sardinia. The Peliset may be the Philistines of biblical fame. The Denyen could be related to the Danaans of Homeric legend, but none of these identifications are certain. The Sea Peoples were not a single tribe or nation. They were a movement, a migration, a rebellion, a wave of displaced peoples seeking new lands. What drove them to attack? Theories abound. Climate change may have played a role. Droughts in Anatolia and the Levant could have triggered famine, forcing populations to move. Earthquakes, evidenced by destruction layers in cities like Troy and Ugarit, may have destabilized urban centers. Economic collapse, as tin supplies dwindled and bronze production faltered, could have undermined military and political systems. Internal strife, dynastic disputes, peasant revolts, may have weakened empires from within. The Sea Peoples, in this view, were not the cause of collapse, but its symptom. Opportunistic raiders exploiting a world already in crisis. Yet the devastation they wrought was real. The Hittite Empire vanished. Hattusa was burned and never rebuilt. Mycenaean palaces fell into ruin. Linear bee writing disappeared. Ugarit, once a thriving port, was destroyed so thoroughly that its archives were buried under ash. In Cyprus, cities like Enkomi were abandoned. In Canaan, urban centers shrank or vanished. Egypt survived, but its influence waned. The international order that had defined the Late Bronze Age an interconnected system of diplomacy, trade, and cultural exchange collapsed. In the aftermath, new cultures emerged. The Philistines settled along the southern coast of Canaan, building cities like Ashkelon and Gaza. Their pottery and architecture suggest Aegean origins, but they adapted quickly to local conditions. In Greece, the so-called Dark Age began a period of reduced population, simpler material culture, and lost literacy. Yet it also laid the groundwork for the rise of classical Greece. In Anatolia, new kingdoms like Phrygia and Lydia rose from the ashes of the Hittites. In the Levant, the Israelites and Phoenicians began to shape their own destinies. The Sea Peoples, then, were both destroyers and midwives of change. Their legacy is ambiguous. They ended an age of kings and palaces, but they also cleared the way for new societies. They shattered the old order, but they did not erase civilization. Instead, they transformed it. The Iron Age that followed was more localized, more diverse, and eventually more resilient. The empires of the Bronze Age had grown too centralized, too dependent on fragile networks. The Sea Peoples exposed those vulnerabilities, and in doing so, forced a reimagining of power. Still, the mystery remains. No single inscription tells us where the Sea Peoples came from, or why they moved. No unified narrative explains their rise or fall. They appear suddenly in the historical record, wreak havoc, and then vanish. Their names survive in Egyptian hieroglyphs and scattered archaeological traces, but their voices are lost. We do not know their songs, their myths, their leaders. We know only their impact. Perhaps that is why they fascinate us. The Sea Peoples are a reminder that history is not always written by the victors. Sometimes it is shaped by the unknown, the migrants, the raiders, the displaced. They remind us that civilizations are fragile, that prosperity can vanish, and that change often comes from the margins. They are the whisper in the ruins, the shadow in the archive, the question that lingers when all else is gone. They came from the sea, and they changed everything. The sun rises over the Valley of Mexico, casting long shadows across the Avenue of the Dead. The Pyramid of the Sun looms in silence. its massive steps once echoing with the footsteps of thousands. The Temple of the Feathered Serpent, carved with serpents and jaguars, stands watch over a city that no longer breathes. Teotihuacan, once the beating heart of Mesoamerica, is quiet now. Its plazas are empty, its murals faded, its homes abandoned. For centuries, it was a marvel of urban planning, culture, and power. And then, without warning, it emptied. No written records explain why. No single event marks its fall. Only ruins remain, whispering of a mystery that still haunts the ancient world. At its height, Teotihuacan was one of the largest cities on Earth. Between 100 and 650 CE, it sprawled across more than 20 square kilometers, housing upwards of 100,000 people. Some estimates suggest even double that. Its influence stretched across Mesoamerica, from the Maya lowlands to the Zapotec highlands. Traders carried obsidian, ceramics, and textiles, stamped with Teotihuacan's unmistakable style. Its architecture was monumental. Pyramids aligned with celestial bodies, apartment compounds organized by social class, and wide boulevards that mirrored the cosmos. It was a city built not just for living, but for meaning. And yet, by the end of the 7th century, it was gone. The collapse of Teotihuacan is one of archaeology's most enduring puzzles. Unlike the Maya, who left behind glyphs and stelae chronicling their rulers and wars, Teotihuacan's people left no written history. Their language is unknown, their rulers unnamed. What remains are the stones, the bones, and the ashes. Recent studies suggest that the city's fall was not sudden, but a slow unraveling. Between 600 and 650 CE, signs of internal unrest begin to appear. Elite compounds were burned, murals defaced. The Temple of the Feathered Serpent, once a center of ritual and power, shows evidence of deliberate destruction. Archaeologists believe this may have been a revolt and uprising from within, perhaps by marginalized groups or rival factions. The city's rigid social structure, with nobles living in palatial compounds and workers in crowded quarters, may have bred resentment. When the balance tipped, the center could not hold. But internal strife was only part of the story. A groundbreaking study published in 2024 revealed that Teotihuacan may have been struck by a series of devastating earthquakes. Between the years 100 and 650 CE, 5 megathrust quakes originating from the Mesoamerican Trench rocked the region. These were not minor tremors. They were powerful enough to damage major buildings, including the city's iconic pyramids. The spatial pattern of destruction across Teotihuacan aligns with seismic fault lines, suggesting that natural disaster played a critical role in the city's decline. Repeated quakes would have shattered infrastructure, disrupted agriculture, and undermined the authority of the ruling elite. In a society where cosmic order and architectural precision were intertwined, such chaos may have been interpreted as divine abandonment. Environmental stress compounded the crisis. The region's reliance on intensive agriculture, especially maize, made it vulnerable to drought. Paleoclimatic data indicates that rainfall patterns shifted during the epiclassic period. Crop yields fell. Food shortages spread. Malnutrition weakened the population, making them more susceptible to disease and unrest. The city's vast population, once its strength, became a liability. Without sufficient resources, Teotihuacan could no longer sustain itself. Trade networks began to falter. Teotihuacan's influence had once reached as far as Tikal, where Maya rulers adopted its iconography and built temples in its style. But as the city weakened, its grip loosened. Regional centers like Cholula and Xochicalco rose in prominence, absorbing refugees and trade routes. The flow of goods, ideas, and tribute that had nourished Teotihuacan slowed to a trickle. Isolation set in. And then, the silence. By 750 CE, Teotihuacan was largely abandoned. Its grand avenues lay empty. Its temples stood unused. The city that had once defined an era became a ghost. The remaining population, Perhaps a few thousand lived among the ruins, eking out a living in the shadow of greatness. Over time, even they disappeared. The memory of Teotihuacan lingered in the cultures that followed. The Aztecs, arriving centuries later, were awestruck by its scale. They named it Teotihuacan, the place where gods were born. They believed it was the site of creation, where the sun and moon had first risen. They made pilgrimages to its pyramids, offered sacrifices in its plazas, and wove its legacy into their own mythology. But they, too, did not know who had built it or why it had fallen. Today, Teotihuacan is one of Mexico's most visited archaeological sites. Tourists climb the Pyramid of the Sun, gaze down the Avenue of the Dead, and marvel at the artistry of its murals. But beneath the surface lies a deeper story, a story of ambition, fragility, and loss. The city's collapse was not the result of a single cause, but a convergence. Earthquakes, drought, rebellion, and economic decline. It was a perfect storm that unraveled one of the ancient world's greatest achievements. And yet, Teotihuacan endures. Its stones still stand. Its layout still guides the eye. Its mystery still captivates. In the silence of its ruins, we hear echoes, not just of what was lost, but of what remains. A reminder that even the grandest cities can fall, and that in their fall, they leave behind questions that may never be answered. They built a city to mirror the cosmos, and when it emptied, the stars kept shining. A silver mist drapes the plains of Punjab and Sindh, softening the outlines of scattered bricks and half-buried walls. In the hush before dawn, you can almost hear a distant footstep, a child's laughter carried across time, the faint drip of water from an ancient well. This is the world the Indus Valley people once knew, a world of quiet order, of measured routines and hidden canals, of homes built around shaded courtyards and streets laid out in perfect grids. And then, as gently as a sigh, it was gone. Imagine Harappa at first light, its streets aligned north-south and east-west, each house crafted from uniform bricks pressed to a precise 1 to 2 to 4 ratio. Smoke rises from hearths. Children fill clay pots at the community well. Merchants adjust seals on leather pouches of carnelian beads bound for distant lands. No shrines dominate the skyline. No royal palace towers overhead. Instead, life hums in the details, the hidden drains beneath doorsteps, the private bathrooms tucked into every dwelling, the granaries that stand ready for lean seasons. This was a civilization built on collective care, on the beauty of routine, and the trust that neighbors would uphold the rules of shared life. Across the valley, Mohenjo-Daro mirrors these patterns on a grander scale. Wide avenues, what we now call the Great Bath Precinct, lead to a massive sundried brick tank, its steps worn smooth by generations of barefoot pilgrims. They came here in quiet procession to step into the cool water, cleansing themselves before festivals or passages in life. Around the bath, rows of rooms once housed priests and caretakers. Above, terraces supported gardens that bloomed with lotus and jasmine. Every brick, every carving, every carefully sited street corner reflected a harmonious blend of form and purpose. Trade wove these cities into a tapestry that reached beyond the mountains and deserts. Indus seals, stamped with enigmatic symbols and the images of unicorn-like beasts, appear in Mesopotamian archives alongside Sumerian cuneiform. They mark shipments of timber, ivory, and copper, traded for lapis lazuli from Afghanistan and silver from the Iranian plateau. Along the coastline at Lothal, warehouse platforms stand above tidal flats, once staging coasts for cedar ships that paused to load shells and beads before sailing down the Arabian Sea. The rhythm of commerce pulsed through every lane and canal, promising abundance even as it forged cultural ties across worlds. Yet amid that promise lay the seeds of mystery. The Indus script etched in miniature on hundreds of seals, and pottery fragments reveals glimpses of administrative lists, clan symbols, perhaps even ritual formulas. and then it falls silent, a fleeting echo we cannot fully hear. We trace the same scant signs again and again: fish, bull, arrow, but no Rosetta Stone unlocks their meaning. We know their hand pressed the seal into wet clay. We feel their aim for order and record, but we do not hear their voice. Around 2200 BCE, the sky above the Himalayas held fewer clouds. Tree rings in remote oases record shorter summers, slower growth. In deep caves, layers of calcite whisper of monsoons that failed to arrive on schedule. Modern scientists call it the 4.2 kiloyear event, a prolonged period of drought that rippled across Asia, the Near East, and North Africa. For cotton and barley, for quinoa and pulses, the missing rains meant withering stems and bare granaries. Perhaps the Gagar Hakra once, a great river coursing toward the sea, shrank to a trickle, leaving channels strewn with silt and salt. Or maybe tectonic shifts nudged the Indus itself to carve a new path, abandoning canals that fed the farmland. Archaeologists digging at Mohenjo-daro find evidence of flooding one generation, then unexpected dryness the next. Wells once dug to sturdy depths lay polluted, offering brackish water laced with minerals that stung the throat. Fields turned pale with crystallized salts, and farmers tasted the irony of water that killed the seeds it should have nourished. With every harvest lost, the veneer of certainty cracked. City councils, perhaps composed of merchant priests or village elders, no longer held sway when wells failed and youth wandered with empty satchels. Without strong centers to coordinate relief, no palaces to gather the grain, no kings to lead the ceremonies, the social contract frayed. As the old order weakened, neighborhoods slipped into self-reliance. Families moved toward forested areas or higher ground where springs still ran. They rebuilt in smaller villages, each group tending its own fields rather than relying on a distant authority. Trade faltered in tandem. Mesopotamia, facing its own upheavals, ash from distant volcanoes, shifts in Tigris-Euphrates channels, political strife purchased less from the Indus. Ships from Dilmun and Megan carried away fewer beads, fewer carnelian necklaces. Caravanserais in Bactria and Afghanistan hosted fewer traders. The steady flow of copper and timber slowed to a drip. Craftsmen left their kilns idle. Workshops closed their doors, leaving only fractured pottery shards to mark prosperity's end. And yet, in true Indus fashion, there was no grand conflagration. No sack by invaders, no cataclysmic battle to topple the city walls. Instead, teardrops of brick fell from the drains, stones settled back into the earth, and life quietly retreated. Archaeological layers show changing pottery styles, slightly thinner walls, new motifs stamped in haste. Clay ovens pivot to smaller batches. The standardized bricks lose their perfect ratio. The grid of streets dissolves into winding paths. These are the traces of daily adaptation, a community seeking to survive rather than enact a last stand. To the east, new cultures arose. In the Ganges plain, the Vedic peoples composed hymns to Agni and Indra, carving their own language into bark and palm leaf. They spoke of rivers Ganga, Yamuna as living deities. They built fire altars and recited sacred chants. Their arrival overlaps the waning of Mohenjo-daro, but whether they displaced the Harappans or simply moved into the emptied spaces remains unclear. Some Harappan towns linger, blending old and new, their descendants carrying beads and seals into second millennium villages. Others vanish entirely, their people assimilated or dispersed beyond the archaeological horizon. The memory of the Harappans endures in unexpected ways. Some scholars trace Vedic myths of a primordial flood back to real inundations that swept away the orchard terraces along the Indus. In folk traditions of Rajasthan and Gujarat, dusty ruins in the desert dunes are called Mohenj, Harappa, or Kvapa, landmarks in oral tales of golden valleys swallowed by sand and river. Down the centuries, Travelers spoke of city ghosts, stone seats set in empty halls, unseen water still dripping in walled squares, and the echo of children's laughter in the ruins at dawn. In the cool hush of early morning, you stand where granaries once rose, their brick bins housing wheat to fuel festivals and sacred rites. The wind whispers through collapsed doorways, as if reading a last verse of an unsung hymn. The thresholds where families stepped into the street now hold only memories sealed in earthen foundations. You might touch the drain cover set flush to the pavement, tracing the groove worn by water and foot over centuries, and feel the pulse of a civilization that prized collective care above all else. We cannot know their names, but we know they cared. They arranged homes around open courtyards, cooled by breezes drawn through narrow alleys. They carved private bathrooms into each dwelling, ensuring that human dignity extended to the most modest life. They stored surplus in communal granaries, signaling that abundance belonged to everyone, that famine was civilization's greatest threat. They wove trade routes to distant kings, forging ties stronger than swords. They inscribed seals not with boastful decrees, but with subtle symbols meant for immediate neighbors, a private contract, a shared promise. And then, in a gentle unraveling, the weave came undone. It was neither a thunderous end, nor a silent disappearance. It was the passing of seasons, the drift of sands, the shifting of rivers, the redirection of commerce, the reorientation of belief. As each thread loosened, the great loom of Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro lost its shape. With each generation, the bricks cooled and the canals silted. The epic of 1,000 years concluded not with a final stanza, but with the soft footfall of people moving on. In that passing, the Indus Valley remains a ghost song in the earth. We hear it in the hollow echo of ruined walls, in the faded stains of red and black pottery, in the collective gasp of archaeologists, unearthing a seal that reads like a poem we cannot translate. We hear it in the wind that scours the dotted remains of warehouses once packed with grain, in the gold-feathered emptiness of the great bath under a starlit sky. We hear it in the silence of a script we cannot break, a voice that has slipped beneath the river silt and into memory's slow current. As the sun climbs higher over these plains today, the ruins endure, beckoning us to lean close and listen. The stones recall the rhythm of everyday life children, gathering clay, merchants weighing spices, priests pouring water in ritual baths. They recall the quiet confidence of a people who built not for glory, but for care. And in that memory lies both lament and hope. Lament for what we cannot recover, and hope that by listening to the ghosts of the Indus, we learn to tend our own fragile cities with equal care, honor, and humanity. They say that long ago, a mighty island kingdom lay beyond the Pillars of Hercules, its towers gleaming in the morning sun, and its harbors filled with ships from every corner of the known world. The name they whispered was Atlantis, a land of astonishing wealth, advanced craftsmanship, and a people proud of their power. Yet, one fateful day and night, the sea claimed it, sending waves crashing over marble streets and swallowing palaces in a single cataclysm. By dawn, the island had vanished beneath the waves, and the very memory of its greatness dimmed like a candle in the wind. We first hear of Atlantis in the voice of Plato, who wrote of it in his dialogues, Timaeus and Critias, around 360 BCE. He spoke of Solon, the Athenian lawgiver, who had learned the tale from Egyptian priests in the courts of Sais and carried it home across the Mediterranean. According to Plato, Atlantis lay farther west than Libya and Asia combined, a vast realm ruled by descendants of the sea god, Poseidon, whose temples gleamed with gold and ivory. Its capital was a city carved in concentric rings of land and water, connected by bridges, canals, and tunnels. Canals wide enough for warships ran through the heart of the city, while fertile fields fed tens of thousands. As the tale goes, the Atlanteans grew arrogant in their wealth and influence. They waged war on distant lands, even setting their sights on Athens itself. But when they turned their hubris against the gods, disaster followed. Earthquakes rent the island, floods poured from the heavens, and the ocean floor opened its maw. In a single day, this mighty kingdom slipped beneath the waves and vanished forever. Plato insisted that his story was more than legend, that it served as a lesson in the fragility of power and the consequences of moral decay. He wrapped his philosophical message in the trappings of geography, mountain peaks, fertile plains, and coastal lagoons. Yet no other Greek writer before or after him mentions this vanished empire. No trace appears in Egyptian temple inscriptions outside of Solon's account. Gradually, scholars came to doubt whether Plato's Atlantis ever existed at all, and many concluded that it was a parable, a thought experiment, rather than a historical record. Still, the dream of Atlantis endured. Through the centuries, explorers and poets imagined lost continents rising from the deep. Renaissance philosophers revived the idea that Plato spoke of real places. Cartographers added islands to their maps where none truly lay. Treasure hunters combed beaches for artifacts. And in the age of steamships, the term lost world came to include not only Atlantis, but sunken reefs, submerged forests, and vanished shorelines. Yet none of these quests yielded the ruins of Plato's concentric city. In modern times, researchers have turned to geology and archaeology for clues. The volcanic eruption of Theratidae's Santorini, around 1600 BCE, sent ash into the sky, triggered tsunamis, and brought ruin to Minoan palaces. The dates differ by centuries, but the image of a prosperous island swallowed by waves feels eerily familiar. At the same time, sea levels were lower than today, exposing coastlines now 8 or 9 meters underwater. Entire plains that once fed cities now lie submerged off the coasts of Greece and Turkey. In the North Atlantic, Doggerland connected Britain to Europe until it drowned around 6500 BCE, leaving only memory in folk tales of floods and lost hunting grounds. Could these real disasters have inspired Plato's allegory? It is plausible that distant memories of coastal migrations, seismic upheavals, and rising waters merged with philosophical imagination to create the legend. Even more intriguing are the stories of other vanished lands, Lemuria, Mu, Thule, each born from the same impulse to explain the unexplainable. In the 19th century, as Darwin's theories remapped humanity's origins, occultists proposed lost continents to fill scientific gaps. Lemuria sprawled across the Indian Ocean, said to have bridged Madagascar and Sri Lanka before drowning beneath shifting tectonic plates. Mu rose in the Pacific, where sunken atoll ruins fueled speculation that high civilization once flourished among the tropics. Thule rested at the edge of the world in ancient Greek myth, far beyond the known islands, home to Hyperborean folk who dwelt in endless summer. These hypotheses were eventually discarded as plate tectonics and oceanography advanced. Yet their persistence shows how powerful the idea of lost worlds can be, an echo of our own fear that progress may one day vanish as suddenly as a morning mist. Scientific advances have opened new possibilities for exploring submerged landscapes. Side-scan sonar maps reveal artificial-looking structures beneath the Adriatic and the Caribbean. Underwater drones photograph stone blocks and street patterns off the coast of Yonaguni, Japan, suggesting a sunken city older than any known in East Asia. In the Black Sea, sediment cores indicate a catastrophic flood around 5600 BCE, a deluge that may have inspired the earliest flood myths from Mesopotamia. These discoveries remind us that the Earth's surface is dynamic, that coastlines shift, oceans rise and fall, and human societies must adapt or perish. But none of these underwater ruins can yet be tied definitively to Plato's Atlantis. Perhaps that is just as well. Plato never revealed the exact coordinates of Atlantis, and he emphasized its collapse as divine judgment. His goal was moral, not geographical. He used the story to warn Athens then, at the height of its power, against corruption and imperial ambition. In that light, Atlantis transcends any single location. It becomes the symbol of every empire that rose on pride and fell from its own excess. It is the whisper in the wind, reminding us that civilizations can vanish overnight, whether to tempest, conquest, or the frailty of values. Yet legends persist for another reason. They speak to our desire for wonder. As children, we stand on the shore and ask whether an ancient city slumbers beneath the waves, waiting to speak again. We float images of coral-encrusted columns, seaweed-draped statues, and jeweled chests open in silence on the ocean floor. We yearn for the unexpected, for the moment when the past shows itself in living color. And it is possible that, someday, a wrecked temple or a patterned plaza will emerge from deep waters, telling us that the line between myth and reality is thinner than we think. If that day comes, it may not be Atlantis, but another world entirely one, unknown to both Plato and us. New techniques in seafloor mapping, underwater robotics, and ancient DNA analysis might uncover human settlements in places now drowned by post-glacial sea level rise. Under driftwood and sediment, there may lie the remains of settlements beyond the Pillars of Hercules, or along shores that have since slid into deeper currents. Each discovery will reshape our understanding of human history, showing that where we thought nothing existed, life once thrived. Until then, Atlantis remains both myth and invitation, a call to explore, to question, to look beneath the surface. It reminds us that history is more than written records. It is the patterns etched in stone, the fossils embedded in seabeds, and the legends passed from lips to ears. Separating myth from history does not diminish the wonder, it deepens it. It shows us how story and science intertwine, how memory can travel across millennia, and how every layer of sand may hide a chapter of our collective past. Tonight, as the waves murmur against distant shores, let the legend of Atlantis drift through your dreams. Picture the concentric rings of land and water, the colonnaded halls alive with music and light, the slender boats slipping out to sea under moonlit skies. And then imagine the stillness that followed the flood, the silence of deep water shrouding grandeur, the slow settling of silt over polished floors, the faint echo of a civilization's last song, carried away on tidal currents. In the end, myth and history share a common current. Both flow from our need to understand who we are and where we have come from. Whether or not Atlantis ever existed in flesh and stone, its legend endures because it speaks to the heart of our humanity, our creativity, our hubris, and our capacity to build and lose great worlds. As you fall into sleep, let these echoes of the deep carry you gently into the night, under a canopy of stars that has seen countless stories rise and sink away, awaiting rediscovery in the silence of the sea. A hush falls over the ruined plaza, and in the stillness you almost hear centuries of footsteps echoing through empty corridors. From the sun-baked stones of Maya citadels to the buried ruins of Harappa, a single question threads through history. Why do great societies vanish? As historians study vanished empires, patterns emerge, recurring rhythms of rise and fall that teach us what to watch for in our own world. First, the land itself can betray its stewards. Ancient Mesopotamian fields once yielded grain beneath the fertile silt of regular floods. But as irrigation canals expanded without natural drainage, salts built up in the soil. Over time, fields turned pale and sterile, and city-states like Ur and Nippur lost the bounty they depended upon. Centuries later, the Maya cleared vast tracts of rainforest for farms and fuel. Without tree roots to hold moisture, rainstorms became flash floods that scoured hillsides, washing away topsoil and ruining terraces. In each case, over-engineering the environment to force greater yields undermined the very soils that sustained civilization. Climate's subtle shift can tip the balance from abundance to scarcity. In the Akkadian Empire of Mesopotamia, ice core records hint at a decades-long drought around 2200 BCE. Reservoirs shrank, and channels ran dry. Farmers abandoned villages. Refugees poured into the cities they once fed. In the lowland jungles of the Maya world, tree ring data reveals multi-year droughts in the 9th century CE. As cenotes fell silent, kings lost their claim to divine favor and citadels emptied. Scholars also point to climate swings in the Khmer. Heartland years of unrelenting monsoon, followed by years of crippling drought undermining Angkor's hydraulic network and scattering its people into the surrounding forests. Resource depletion often follows rapid growth. On Easter Island, Rapa Nui chiefs ordered the construction of massive stone statues moai each, weighing tens of tons. To transport them, every last palm was felled for rollers and sledges. Bird populations collapsed. Crops failed on eroded slopes. Clans turned on each other in the final struggle for dwindling firewood. Across the world, growth left little margin for recycling. Forests, fish stocks, or metal ore veins were harvested to exhaustion, leaving once prosperous societies perched on empty shelves. Wealth can hollow out a society from within. In the late Roman Republic, land concentrated in the hands of a few patrician families, while small farmers sank into debt bondage. As common soldiers lost their land, the citizen army faltered. When generals recruited private legions from the landless poor men, loyal to a general rather than the Senate civil war followed. In medieval China's Song dynasty, eunuch corruption at court siphoned tax revenues. Meanwhile, wealthy landowners evaded labor service, leaving peasants overburdened and hungry. Revolts like the Red Turbans found fertile ground in inequality as faith in the state collapsed. Corruption and ineffective leadership compound any crisis. Succession struggles in the Hittite Empire left the throne vacant or contested, and empty palaces were no longer centers of rice redistribution or canal repair. In the Aztec Empire, tribute collectors grew so accustomed to extorting excess that when a volcanic eruption and crop failures struck, even the noble class withheld payments. With no central authority strong enough to coordinate relief, city-states folded in turn. Trade binds empires together, and when it breaks, so does prosperity. The network of Bronze Age commerce linked Mycenae, Ugarit, Babylon, and Egypt. Bronze for weapons required tin from far-off hills, copper from Cyprus. Evidence of Sea People's raids is often accompanied by a grain-filled Aegean pot half-melted by fire. Trade collapsed, cities starved, and the late Bronze Age world unraveled. 1,000 years later, medieval Venice rose on salt and fish, but feared pirates on the Adriatic. Coastal towns secured trade with armed convoys. When Genoa and Venice fell out, the ripple of embargoes plunged towns into poverty. Empires that overextend themselves invite disaster. Building roads to the ends of the earth taxes manpower and coffers. The Han Dynasty's Silk Road caravans required thousands of guards to secure routes. When Xiongnu invasions overran border garrisons, supply chains snapped. In Rome, new provinces meant new legions. When barbarian hordes pressed in on the Rhine and Danube simultaneously in the 4th century CE, legions split their forces and fell back. Overextension without sufficient reserves left both empires vulnerable to shock. Disease can topple the mightiest capitals. In 541 CE, the Justinian plague struck Constantinople with such fury that half the city perished in months. Grain shipments from Egypt and Sicily dwindled as workers died in the fields. With tax revenues evaporating, the imperial administration faltered. 7 centuries later, the Black Death carried by Genoese ships wiped out nearly half of Europe. Fields lay empty, manors collapsed, social order buckled. Labor shortages reshaped demographics, but only after waves of panic and violence rocked medieval society. Invaders at the gate seized the moment of weakness. When the Western Roman Empire teetered under internal strife and depleted coffers, the Visigoths crossed the Danube and ravaged Italy. When the Tang dynasty's court was distracted by rebellion and famine, Uyghur horsemen looted Chang'an. Nomadic confederations, Huns, Mongols, Pechenegs routed urban armies, cutting supply lines and scattering administrators. Once the ruling elite lost its monopoly on violence, allegiance fractured and city walls stood empty. Social cohesion matters as much as brick and mortar. In ancient Egypt, the pharaoh's divine status bound the kingdom in a shared ritual calendar. When Akhenaten appended tradition to worship Aten alone, priests of Amun-Ra seized the opportunity to reclaim temples, eroded central unity, and set Egypt on a path of civil struggle once his successors tried to reverse the change. Similarly, when the Inca Empire's sacred covenant with Inti was seen as broken by El Niño floods, Andean communities fell back to local cults rather than rallying to Cusco. Technological stagnation can doom adaptation. Civilizations that fail to innovate irrigation, crop varieties, or building techniques leave themselves exposed when the environment shifts. The ancestral pueblones of Chaco Canyon lacked low-slump concrete to repair their sunken kivas when floods followed droughts. In contrast, contemporaneous Pueblo farmers in the Rio Grande Valley adapted by building elevated agricultural terraces that captured new runoff, ensuring their survival into the Spanish era. Multiple stressors often converge. A drought-ruined harvest may trigger peasant revolt, inviting marauding armies seeking easy prey. A plague-weakened labor force leaves canals unrepaired. An earthquake collapses temple foundations, undermining faith in divine protection. In each case, it is the perfect storm of environmental, social, and political failures that finishes a civilization, not any single cause in isolation. Yet history also records paths to resilience. In medieval Japan, daimyo encouraged rice diversification, taro, millet, barley to buffer against drought. In the Norse colonies of Greenland, community councils rationed whale oil and stored driftwood to survive decades of cool summers. The Byzantine Empire institutionalized grain tax reserve depots and mobile field hospitals during Justinian's successors, dampening the plague's mortal terror. Some Maya centers built water storage cisterns carved into bedrock, which allowed them to weather the worst drought years. 3 lessons shine through these vanished worlds. 1. Humility before nature. No canal system or road network endures forever without attentive maintenance and respect for ecological limits. 2. Equity in governance. When rulers share sacrifice and transparent decision-making, societies hold together in crisis. And 3. Adaptation through innovation, cultivating crop diversity, investing in public health, and monitoring environmental signals can turn collapse into transformation. As the sun sets on the broken gateways of ancient cities, their lessons echo for our global civilization. We, too, face climate extremes, dwindling resources, widening inequality, and pandemics. The patterns of collapse are well-worn grooves in history's record. By recognizing them in the salinized soils of irrigated fields, in the fault-line tremors beneath our cities, in the stalled caravans and rising waves, we can choose a different path. We can build resilience into our institutions, diversify our economies, and honor the fragile balance between people and planet. In the quiet stones of Teotihuacan, in the half-sunken walls of Mohenjo-Daro, in the burned ramps of Angkor Wat, we find not only traces of endings, but the contours of new beginnings. The ghosts of vanished civilizations murmur in our ears. Prepare, adapt, share, and innovate lest we become today's vanished empire, remembered only in dust and lesson. A hush falls over the world when you realize that the same forces that toppled once, mighty empires, still shape our lives today. In deserts cracked by drought, in coastlines battered by storms, in city streets echoing with protest, the fragility of our modern civilization mirrors haunting patterns from the distant past. As you listen, let these echoes guide your thoughts beyond history's ruins and into the living world we share. Imagine a river valley where farmers once coaxed millet and barley from rich silt until irrigation canals, left unmaintained, crystallized in salt. Mesopotamia's earliest city-states fell as their soils poisoned themselves, leaving fields barren and people scattered. Now, picture California's Central Valley, where overpumping of groundwater has drained vast aquifers and left the earth hushed with empty wells. Salinity creeps into irrigated land as almonds and lettuce struggle under a sun that grows harsher each year. Like ancient Sumer's farmers swapping metals for food, modern agribusiness finds itself importing water through virtual pipelines of grain, a reminder that soil remains civilization's foundation and that neglect can turn abundance into ruin. In the jungle-covered temples of the classic Maya, deforestation triggered flash floods that tore away terraces and scrubbed away topsoil. Their cities, once crowned by lofty pyramids, emptied as fields failed and drought tightened its grip. Today, in the Amazon and Southeast Asia, vast swaths of rainforest yield to chainsaws and palm plantations. When the trees go, the rains bounce off sun-baked earth, rivers swell with silt, and once fertile floodplains erode into dust. The loss of forest cover disrupts monsoons and water cycles. Echoing the collapse of hydraulic empires, the lords of water brought low by short-term gain. In our age, each felled grove and burning slope reminds us how closely civilization as breath depends on the green lungs of the planet. Climate swings that once felled Akkadian kings and fringe civilizations now reverberate globally. Ice cores record droughts that shrank empires. Coral reefs record heat waves that bleach ecosystems. The heat-driven droughts in the American Southwest stripped ancestral Puebloan fields, just as prolonged aridity ravages the Colorado River Basin today. Reservoirs dwindle to stumps. Taps sputter in heat waves. Governments declare water emergencies. Farmers watch their futures dry in the blink of a season. The ancient lesson is clear. Food security rests on reliable water. When the rains shift, so does the fate of nations. Resource exhaustion played its part in many ancient tragedies. On remote Easter Island, chiefs ordered every grove cut to haul statues, stripping soil of roots and birds of branches. The islanders fought over the last scraps of food and wood until only toppled moai and empty gardens remained. In our oceans, industrial fishing fleets chased dwindling shoals of tuna and cod. Dead zones swell in nutrient-rich runoff. Coral reefs vanish under warming seas. Fragile marine ecosystems buckle under nets and pollution, denying coastal communities the sustenance their ancestors once relied upon. Just as no island can stand without its trees, no shoreline can survive without healthy seas. Wealth and inequality have always hollowed societies from within. In the late Roman Republic, vast estates eclipsed small farms, rendering free citizens destitute and fueling the rise of private armies loyal to charismatic generals. Today, the richest 1% command fortunes larger than entire nations. Automation and globalization have pushed smallholders and factory workers aside, even as technology magnates ascend. Cities seethe with protest over housing shortages, wage stagnation, and crumbling infrastructure. When wealth concentrates and public trust erodes, social cohesion frays, as it did in Rome, as it did in Han China, when landless peasants rose under the yellow turban banner. The ancient and the modern share this. Prosperity that excludes ultimately sows the seeds of its own undoing. Trade networks once bound Bronze Age empires, carrying tin from Britain, lapis from Afghanistan, cedar from Lebanon. When these networks snapped through piracy, war, or resource scarcity, the late Bronze Age world collapsed in a cascade of famine and migration. Today, as global supply chains stretch from silicon mines in Chile to electronics factories in Taiwan to supermarkets in New York, a port shutdown in Suez or a chip shortage in Taiwan reverberates across continents, halting factories, emptying shelves, and stalling hospitals. The speed and scale of modern trade amplify both prosperity and vulnerability. A single choke point can unleash ripples as devastating as the Sea People's raids once did across the Mediterranean. Disease has toppled empires more swiftly than any sword. The Justinian plague cut Constantinople's population in half, starving armies and draining treasuries. The Black Death rewrote Europe's social order, empowering laborers even as it decimated communities. In our age, global air travel turned local outbreaks into global crises within weeks. COVID-19 shuttered classrooms, emptied offices, and brought economies to a standstill. Infections tore through unprepared health systems. Supply chains faltered under mask and medicine shortages. The ancient lesson stands. Pathogens exploit complexity and connection. Our modern shield vaccines, antiviral drugs, intensive care blunts the blow, but only as long as we maintain robust public health and equitable access. When invaders breached ancient walls, they often found cities weakened from within by famine, pestilence, or revolt. Genghis Khan rode through walled cities whose armies had been hollowed by plague. Visigoths entered Rome's gates when its legions marched elsewhere. In our world, the invader may be cyber attack or misinformation rather than cavalry. Digital networks link banks, power grids, and water systems, but without resilient firewalls and emergency protocols, a single breach can shut down cities. Social media platforms can spread rumors that undermine trust in elections or vaccines, fracturing civic bonds more effectively than any army. The gates of our digital empires stand exposed if we ignore the ancient lesson. Walls are only as strong as the society within them. Complexity itself brings peril. Empires grew by weaving intricate systems, taxes, roads, markets, armies, that multiplied strength. But with each new complex layer came new failure modes. Canal systems required constant dredging. Aqueducts needed repair. Bureaucracies demanded administrators. In our era, complexity springs from global finance, automated logistics, and algorithmic decision-making. High-frequency trading can crash markets in seconds. Just-in-time manufacturing leaves no buffer for delays. Smart grids optimize energy flow, but risk cascading blackouts if a single node falters. We chase efficiency, but as history shows, efficiency without redundancy is brittle like a bridge designed for light traffic that collapses under one overloaded truck. We pay a price when governance lags behind change. In ancient China's great empires, court eunuchs and corrupt officials siphoned revenue, leaving provincial governors and peasants to shoulder taxes for waterworks they could not maintain. Revolts erupted, fracturing the central state. Today, our transnational challenges, climate change, pandemics, cyber threats, outpace the capacity of any single government. International coordination falters when competing interests hijack talks on emissions reductions or vaccine distribution. Local administrations struggle to retrofit infrastructure for rising seas or extreme heat. The ancient pattern reappears. When institutions cannot address collective risks, societal bonds weaken and fragmentation follows. Yet the echoes from antiquity also hold seeds of hope. After collapse, some societies rebuilt on more resilient foundations. In medieval Japan, villagers organized to ration water and rotated fields under irrigation associations, ensuring food supply for all. In Venice, the Black Death prompted reforms. Quarantine stations at lagoon entrances, rudimentary public health boards, and the cordon sanitaire. These measures evolved into modern sanitation and infectious disease control. Today, global institutions like the World Health Organization draw from those lessons: surveillance, rapid response teams, data sharing to guard against new pandemics. Climate adaptation offers another bridge between past and future. Ancient Andean farmers built terraced fields that captured scarce mountain runoff. Hawaiian settlers carved fish ponds that balanced fish stocks and agriculture. Modern agroforestry experiments emulate these systems, planting shade trees among coffee, restoring mangrove coastlines to buffer storm surges. and reviving indigenous water harvesting techniques in arid lands. By blending time-tested wisdom with cutting-edge science, we create agricultural landscapes that endure drought, floods, and changing seasons. Building redundancy into our systems can fortify resilience. Ancient Persian engineers dug multiple Qanat tunnels to tap aquifers, ensuring that if one shaft collapsed, others sustained villages. Today, we invest in diversified energy portfolios: solar, wind, hydro, thermal, so that one outage does not black out nations. We develop decentralized microgrids, local food systems, and community water catchments. These measures echo the ancient principle: do not put all your wells in one valley. Equity emerges again as a cornerstone of durable societies. Medieval European guilds pooled resources to support members struck by plague. Communities established almshouses and grain stores for the poorest. Modern social safety nets, unemployment insurance, universal health care, food assistance reflect that ethos. When every citizen has a stake in recovery, social cohesion strengthens. History warns us: collapse often follows when the many bear the burden of a few. Cultural memory can guide future choices. In the American Southwest, Pueblo communities preserve oral histories of drought and flood, teaching children when to plant and when to gather root crops. In Norway, villages archive centuries of flood data to inform infrastructure design. By keeping ancestral knowledge alive alongside scientific records, societies attune to environmental rhythms that exceed the span of any single lifetime. Finally, the greatest lesson lies in humility. Empires of stone and bronze fell to forces beyond any ruler's control. Shifting climates, shifting seas, shifting sands. Our megacities and digital networks may feel invincible, but they too stand on a dynamic planet. A single tipping point in melting permafrost, in a thawed coral reef, in a collapsed data center, can cascade into wide-ranging effects. Recognizing that vulnerability is universal spurs cooperation. It reminds us that no country, no corporation, no community stands alone when drought or disease or storm clouds gather. As you drift towards sleep, consider this: the ghosts of Harappa and Chaco Canyon whisper through our modern supply chains. The spirits of Angkor and Easter Island murmur in our levees and forests. They remind us that the line separating flourishing society from collapse can be thinner than we imagine. But they also call us to action, to build systems that renew rather than deplete, to govern with fairness, not just efficiency, to invest in diversity and redundancy, and to learn from both ancient and emerging knowledge. In those choices lies our civilization's resilience, our promise that the echoes of the past will not become the epitaph of our own time. A hush falls across the hall of history when we stand before the empty doorways of vanished empires. Their walls, once alive with color and sound, now rise in silent testimony to lives fully lived, and then abruptly ended. Why do these empty stones and broken columns still draw us in, whispering of worlds lost to time? What is it in our nature that clings to the faintest echo of a people as laughter, or the whisper of a trader as pack on a desert road? These questions form the enduring mystery of vanished civilizations, their power to captivate our imaginations and to warn us of our own precarious place in a fragile world. We begin in the cool dawn light among the crumbling steps of a Mesoamerican pyramid. Imagine stepping lightly over moss-covered terraces, each stone inscribed with glyphs we cannot fully decipher. The plaza below, once thronged with festival crowds, now lies empty except for the call of a lone bird. Yet even in that silence, we sense the pulse of life that once quickened these stones, the stomp of dancers' sandals, the barter of merchants beneath cloth awnings, the drumbeat of priests invoking gods for rain. We feel the ache of absence, the knowledge that, within a few generations, no living person walked these paths, no child traced these carvings with chalky fingers, no loom wove cloth in neighboring compounds. That sense of absence, of a world once vivid, now dissolved, speaks to something in us all. We are storytellers by nature, weaving narratives to bind past to present. When historians unearth a buried courtyard, or when satellite images reveal the outlines of a lost city beneath desert sands, we lean forward with curiosity. Each new discovery prompts questions. Who lived here? What did they build their lives around? What dreams and fears guided their hands as they shaped stone and clay? These questions are more than academic. They are our way of reaching across millennia, seeking common ground with people who never heard our names. We are drawn to vanished civilizations for the same reason we speak in whispers when the lights go out, because mystery invites us to imagine. In the absence of complete records, every uncarved rock becomes a blank page, every fragmented pot a tale half told. Our minds fill in the gaps with possibility. The thought that an ancient astronomer once stood atop a tower charting the moon's passage. That a farmer once tended a maize field precisely aligned to sunrise on the solstice. That a queen once administered justice beneath a banyan tree. In these imaginings, we forge a bridge of empathy, a fleeting sense that the hopes and struggles of those long gone are not so different from our own. Yet the captivation runs deeper than mere curiosity or empathy. Vanished civilizations serve as living warnings. The abrupt end of a great city, whether by drought, invasion, plague, or internal collapse, reminds us that success can breed vulnerability. When we gaze at the stones of Angkor Wat, half swallowed by jungle vines, we see the consequences of overextended waterworks in a changing climate. When we stand among the sun-blasted walls of Ketelyuk, we recall how early agriculture shaped social inequality and ecological stress. When we trace the outlines of ocean-facing homes in Mohenjo-Daro, we understand how shifting rivers can rewrite the fate of empires. These lessons have a timbre of urgency. No society is immune to forces both human and natural. History shows us that collapse rarely follows a single cause. Instead, it is the convergence of stressors, environmental upheaval, economic strain, political fragmentation, and pandemics that breaks the thread of continuity. In the Old World, the Bronze Age collapse saw Mycenaean palaces fall silent, Hittite citadels burn, and Egyptian granaries run dry. In the New World, the terminal classic Maya cities emptied with little fanfare, leaving emerald forests to reclaim their broad avenues. In each case, regional systems geared to a particular climate and economy lost flexibility when that system was pushed beyond its limits. As modern societies face climate change, resource depletion, and global pandemics, the analogies feel uncomfortably close. We also find in vanished civilizations a mirror reflecting our own human frailty. The hubris of empires that claim divine sanction, the accumulation of wealth by a privileged few, the disregard for sustainable stewardship of land and water, these patterns repeat across time. In Rome, concentrated estates undermined small farmers. In Qin Dynasty China, massive state projects exhausted laborers. In Easter Island, relentless deforestation eroded every hillside. Today, when corporate deforestation strips forests faster than they regrow, when economic inequality reaches extremes unseen in centuries, or when we pour concrete over wetlands that once held back storm surges, we replay ancient dramas with modern scripts. But history offers more than caution. It also offers resilience. Societies that learn to adapt, whether through crop diversification, communal resource management, or innovations in water storage, often survived where less flexible neighbors fell. In medieval Japan, rice-pounding villages formed federated councils that managed irrigation equitably. In medieval Venice, plague-borne challenges gave rise to the first formal quarantine stations on Lazaretto Vecchio. In early West African kingdoms, shifting trade routes across the Sahara spurred urban planning that pulled grain in times of bounty to avert famine and drought. From these examples, we learned that adaptation, cooperation, and foresight can avert the fate of unyielding civilizations. The enduring mystery lies not just in the ruins, but in the arc of memory. Some vanished civilizations slipped from view almost instantly, their languages lost, their names forgotten. Others survived in fragmentary traditions, oral stories, biblical references, folk myths that kept faint echoes alive for centuries until rediscovered by archaeologists. The Bible's tales of Sodom and Gomorrah may preserve a memory of Bronze Age city destruction. Plato's story of Atlantis may dramatize the fall of a powerful island civilization. In these echoes we glimpse the interplay of history and myth, how factual catastrophes become moral lessons, how vanished worlds feed the human need for allegory, and how timeless narratives shape culture. Our fascination with lost civilizations extends into popular culture. Novels like H.P. Lovecraft's At the Mountains of Madness reimagine ancient Antarctic cities. Films like Apocalypto depict the last days of Mayan centers. Video games like Assassin's Creed let players explore virtual reconstructions of ancient Rome or Egypt. Each retelling builds on that core mystery, the tension between marvel and dread, between discovery and ruin. By playing these stories, we engage with the same impulse that drove real explorers to African deserts or Amazonian headwaters in search of Patiti, the fabled Inca lost city of gold. Yet as we indulge the spirit of adventure, we also honor the scientific quest to understand real people behind the myths. Interdisciplinary research combining archaeology, paleoclimatology, genetics, and anthropology unlocks new chapters. Ancient DNA from skeletal remains reveals migration patterns that reshape our understanding of cultural diffusion in prehistoric Europe. Sediment cores from lake beds record pollen changes that chronicle forest clearance and cultivation. LiDAR surveys beneath rainforest canopies reveal hidden causeways and terraces, once invisible to ground-level explorers. Each advance peels back a layer of dust to reveal the complexity of human endeavor. But with every new discovery comes fresh questions. As we probe deeper into Neolithic settlements, we ask how early farmers balanced land use and social equity. As we map Bronze Age trade networks, we seek the mechanisms that allowed tin to crisscross continents. As we analyze isotopes in human teeth, we uncover stories of migration and childhood, vivid fragments of lives lived under moods of both stability and upheaval. The more we learn, the more porous the boundary between vanished and living cultures becomes. Ultimately, the enduring mystery of vanished civilizations speaks to our shared vulnerability and creativity. We see ourselves in the architects of Machu Picchu, perched high in the Andes, weaving terraced fields that clung to steep slopes. We admire the ingenuity of Indus Valley planners, who built private bathrooms and municipal trains 2 millennia before Rome's aqueducts. We recognize our intellectual forebears in the scholars of Timbuktu, who preserved manuscripts in desert libraries threatened by sand and political turmoil. In their triumphs and tragedies, we recognize the fragile brilliance of human societies. And so, as you drift into quiet thought, let the ghosts of vanished civilizations visit you, not as mere curiosities, but as living teachers. Let their empty plazas remind you of the promise and peril of building great communities. Let their silent walls warn you that power, unchecked by humility and foresight, can shatter in a single season. Let their hidden scripts inspire you to listen more closely to the land, to one another, to the rhythms of change that shape every civilization, no matter how advanced. In the end, the true mystery is not why those cities vanished, but how their echoes continue to shape and caution our own unfolding story.